Chapter 573. Ding! The afterglow of the setting sun shone on the forest adjacent to the plains, and the red light brought a little warmth to the world with its final reluctance. In the tree hole that was entangled with poisonous snakes, the black-haired boy, who had woken up from his deep sleep due to the system's prompt, quietly opened his eyes. Luoya, who had just woken up, stared at the sunset through the gaps of the leaves for a moment. He gradually regained consciousness. He felt his body and found that the heat that almost melted him had disappeared and was replaced by a cool coolness. At this time, there were fewer weeds in the distance. On the ground that could barely be considered a road, there were some skeletons and fragments of armor left behind. It was obvious that the human soldiers would not come here. These were the remains of the mutants who had died in battle and were used as food by the mutants. Staring at the debris on the roadside, the black-haired youth frowned deeply. After the first batch of mutants, Luoya saw with his own eyes that there were 2 batches of reinforcements totaling more than 10,000 people. In addition to the ones that passed by when he was asleep, the entire southern forest of the Tucker Plains could be said to be filled with tens of thousands of mutants. Collector would not let him fall into such a dangerous place and return safely. If he did not move quickly, it was almost certain that he would be found by the believers of the Savior. In addition, the encirclement of the mutants should also be forming, and the evidence was the eagle-like monsters soaring in the sky in the distance. Other than forming an encirclement, Luoya could not think of any other reason for these beasts to stand guard. What he had to do now was to quickly leave before the encirclement was formed. After the bloodline upgrade, Luoya's reward finally appeared. But what Luoya did not expect was that the reward this time was far more generous than he imagined. Received Crown Stone. You have received a skill. You have received a skill. Generating skill details. Looking at the sudden reward that appeared in the system, the black-haired youth's expression was exceptionally excited. The Crown Stone of the 6 Disasters could be said to be the most direct thing to increase Luoya's battle strength. It was also a power that was difficult for anyone to defend against. But what he didn't expect was that this time, the historical fragment actually gave him 2 abilities of the Crown Stone. After some analysis, Luoya more or less figured out the reason. The only thing that the young man lacked was the light of devouring Crown Stone. Because he defeated the Savior together with Luoya, he didn't meet the death condition to obtain the Crown Stone. However, Luoya didn't mind it. After all, the Crown Stone was Luoya's last soul. Molten Core, side effect, high fever, a skill from one of the primordial calamities. It is the manifestation of the power of space that devours all things and erases their existence. Any living being within the silver mist will be stripped of their existence. The degree of destruction will change according to the changes of the curse power and time. All in all, the effects of the 2 skills didn't exceed Luoya's expectations. They were both weakened versions of the 6 Disasters. Among them, the mechanism of the devouring silver mist was somewhat similar to Luoya's other skill, corrosive time breath. Their effects were gradually stacked according to practical experience. But what he didn't expect was that the side effects of both skills were so similar. For the sake of insurance, let me ask. The side effects of the devouring silver mist are, there's an ancient saying, heaven moves vigorously, a gentleman should you're singing? Ding! The side effects of the skill are unknown. Please consider it yourself. Are you fucking Indian? The system's detection might fail in the face of skills related to time and space. Luoya already knew this. Besides, even though the system would occasionally screw up, it was still quite reliable most of the time and had indeed helped Luoya a lot. In the situation where the side effects were uncertain, Luoya, who suffered a great loss from the corrosive time breath, didn't want to eat crabs anymore. On the other hand, the black-haired young man's current physical condition didn't allow him to do so. He definitely couldn't use it in a short period of time. At least, he had to get out of danger first. But although Luoya had entered the sealed sequence, he still couldn't hide his joy about obtaining this Crown Stone. Because after obtaining this Crown Stone, the threat of the concealing mist that the black-haired young man didn't know how to deal with was greatly reduced. With this thought in mind, Luoya slowly raised his head and looked at the silver moon in the sky silently with a complicated gaze. After a long time, he once again paid attention to his condition. He found that the fusion of the source substance of the crown was still ongoing, and the channel of the ancient gods didn't improve either. Luoya murmured to himself while pressing on his glabella. However, halfway through his sentence, his body suddenly stiffened. After that, he abruptly raised his head and looked outside the tree hole. Tonight, the southern part of the Tucker Plains wasn't cloudy and rainy. On the contrary, it wasn't dark at all. Under such weather, the monsters in the forest were abnormally active. Hunting, killing, and bloodshed became the main theme of the night. It was a sudden silence that came without warning. The moment it appeared, the world was like a gorgeous and lifelike background painting. Almost all sound disappeared. In an instant, only the sound of the wind was left between heaven and earth. All the creatures in the entire forest area fell into silence. In the tree hole, the black-haired young man also widened his eyes as he felt an unbearable heavy pressure. Such a situation gave the young man a strong, ominous premonition. He began to quickly think about the source of this aura. No, it's even higher than that. Wait, could this be the Tucker Plains? There was indeed an individual who was out of the norm and was regarded as the ultimate threat by humans. The moment he thought of this name, the sense of crisis in Luo Ya's heart suddenly exploded. He immediately realized the seriousness of the problem. Just like the current human race only had the king of the race, but not the king of the human race. In the past several wars with the mutants never had such a king. But this time, the situation seemed to have changed. And this also represented the arrival of an irresistible disaster. It was a mysterious black sphere that appeared out of nowhere. There seemed to be endless black smoke rolling within it. When it appeared, countless mutants in the forest roared and knelt down to worship it. The next moment, an intense black light suddenly flashed from within, covering the entire area and illuminating the entire area. The intense pain made Luo Ya's face turn pale. But at this time, he didn't care about that. The moment such a thought appeared in his mind, the flashing black light suddenly converged. The invisible heavy pressure also converged into a bundle. In the tree hole, the black-haired young man's body burst out under the heavy pressure. The indestructible body skill was automatically activated. Nine-headed snake staff. Under Roha's unreservedly infusion, the ancient berserk beast regained its former glory, and what followed was a mythical scene. Amidst the explosion of trees, 9 gigantic snake heads soared into the sky from the edge of the forest. They snarled madly as though they were about to devour their enemies. Facing such a situation, the flickering black sphere erupted abruptly, releasing a destructive radiance. At the edge of the forest, the black-haired young man endured the pain in his soul and urged all his curse power. Under the violent impact, the sturdy scales of the 9-headed snake were shattered. Its flesh exploded, and its bones turned into dust. However, under the effect of the enhanced regeneration skill, new snake heads constantly appeared in front of the young man. In the seesaw battle, Luo Ya's remaining curse power was quickly exhausted. The black sphere in the sky also rapidly shrank under the attack. The next moment, a violent explosion occurred. The young man's vision instantly turned into a white light. Chapter 574. At the edge of the Tucker Plains, thick smoke and dust covered the sky. Billowing flames illuminated the sky. Amidst the crackling sounds of burning trees, countless creatures in the forest fled frantically, desperately running towards the depths of the forest. The hazy consciousness brought with it a sense of unreality. The feeling of powerlessness spreading throughout the body made people want to close their eyes and sleep. In the billowing smoke and dust, Luo Ya, who had just woken up, blinked his eyes and lost the sense of his body for a moment. The sudden explosion almost instantly destroyed the 5 snake heads that still existed at that time. The violent shock wave rushed to the ground with a rain of blood, almost crushing everything below into meat paste. Fortunately, at the critical moment, the self-protection mechanism of the Hydra staff was activated. A greenish-black light erupted from the staff, forming a snake scale-like barrier. Slightly tilting his head to look at the shattered and burning trees and mounds of earth, the black-haired teenager's expression was as dignified as water. Yes, This was the result of the remaining half of the attack, and from this, he could roughly speculate the overall picture of the attack. Just now, the pressure that made everything in the world silent, as if the master of heaven and earth had returned, its real strength was definitely not what the previous attack showed. If Luoya didn't guess wrong, that black sphere was probably just one of the many detection spells released by the enemy in order to find the whereabouts of Luoya. Woo! Although the black sphere had exhausted its spell power in the confrontation with Luoya, the black-haired teenager had also exposed his position. The aftermath of the battle between the two was extremely wide, and tens of thousands of aliens in the forest also found the direction of Luoya in the explosion. Through the scattered smoke and dust, the black-haired teenager who sensed the number of enemies had an extremely dignified expression. After experiencing the previous encounter, Luoya had basically lost the ability to fight with the alien army. Now the enemy seemed weak, but in fact, the danger level in Luoya's eyes was higher than the previous black sphere. In a short moment, thousands of arrows rose into the air and turned into a murderous dark cloud that blasted towards Luoya's location. On the other side, the black-haired teenager endured the severe pain in his body and held the staff beside him. In the hoarse call, the giant snake shadow once again appeared in the thick smoke. It opened its mouth and let out a frightening roar, and used its body to shield Luoya, who fell to the ground. Dense striking sounds came like rain, and continuous explosions fell on the giant snake's body. But unlike before, although it also let out a roar, the Hydra wasn't seriously injured this time. Instead, it was enraged and launched a counterattack. Chapter 575. In the southern part of the Tucker Plains, an intense light flashed across the sky. In an instant, the entire region was illuminated as though it was daytime. Then, it quickly extinguished, like a bright light that was accidentally lit and quickly turned off, or like the traces left behind by a meteor across the night sky. Boom! The mutants who were protecting the priests raised their shields and shouted loudly, trying their best to resist the aftermath of the spell's failure. In the forest, the light spear swept away everything like the brush of a god. Wait, Nuwa-Iyer. When did she become so strong? But this seemingly unbreakable spell was easily defeated by the golden-haired angel. This situation could be said to be a pleasant surprise for Luoya. However, after lifting his head, the black-haired young man couldn't be happy because he discovered that after the initial surprise, the young lady's emotions had once again undergone a drastic change. No matter if it was the difficulties in the historical fragment or the thrill of facing the Angel King, Nuwa-Iyer had never shed a tear. To the young lady who had been extremely strict with herself since young, tears weren't something that a ruler should have. It was also a sign of weakness. If all of this is real, Nuwa-Iyer, don't worry, it's me, Luoya Rakat. Hearing Luoya's words, Nuwa-Iyer sobbed even harder. The black-haired young man smiled gently. He caressed the young lady's cheeks and reached out his hand to wipe away the tears on her face. The young man revealed a pitiful expression. Hearing his words, Nuwa-Iyer nodded, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. It's been a year. You're finally back. Before this, although Luoya guessed that the time he spent in the historical fragment would be much longer than before, he didn't expect it to be this long. Thinking of this, the black-haired young man was speechless. For a moment, he didn't know where to start explaining to Nuwa-Iyer. On the other side, Nuwa-Iyer, who was holding the chain in her hand, sobbed with reddened eyes. In the end, the golden-haired young lady couldn't help but cover her mouth and sob. Her sorrowful look made Luoya's heart ache. However, before the black-haired young man said anything, a powerful aura suddenly came from the enemy's formation. At the same time, the remaining mutants in the forest began to gather again. Sensing the strength of the enemy, Luoya, who was exhausted due to various reasons, suddenly frowned. He wanted to remind Nuwa-Iyer, but he realized that the Nuwa-Iyer was staring at Luoya's body at this moment. Chapter 576. Inside the cave, the blonde girl looked at Luoya in front of her. Finally, she showed a determined expression. After hearing Nuwa-Iyer's words, the black-haired boy couldn't help but look serious. Let's not mention that when Luoya left, Akat territory was under attack. The war between the mutants and the humans made Luo Ya particularly concerned. After all, Luo Ya's father, Ka Dia, was at the front line at that time, and the humans had already formulated an attack plan in spring. But now, seeing the princess's expression, Luo Ya had a bad premonition in his heart. As if to confirm this point, Nuwa Iyer also said the truth. Worry and fear began to grow in his heart. For a moment, Luo Ya didn't know how to react. As if she expected the boy's emotional change, the blonde girl showed a distressed expression. She held Luo Ya's cheeks with both hands and said softly, "Seriously injured? Then what's the matter with the king of the race?" In the year after you left, it seems that under the influence of the resurrection of the Savior, the mutant strength began to increase like never before. The most obvious point is that the number of long-range priests began to increase. Thinking of the burning clouds above the mutants' army last night, the black-haired boy couldn't help but reveal a look of understanding. Nuwa Iyer nodded in affirmation. Nuwa Iyer? The princess lowered her head and closed her eyes. She said so to suppress the surging emotions in her heart. Then, she raised her head and said again. The two sides of Nuwa Iyer. This was something Luo Ya knew since childhood. The princess must be dignified in front of others and must not be weak in front of the enemy. However, in the face of so many deaths and injuries of loved ones, how could she be indifferent? The boy hugged Nuwa Iyer, hoping that she could vent more, but unfortunately, the princess didn't stay long. After crying a few times, the girl raised her head, as if there was something she needed to tell Luo Ya. She continued to speak with a hoarse voice. Nuwa Iyer? Ai Lizzie is missing. The moment he heard this news, the black-haired boy's face froze. His body stiffened. Like an old man with bad hearing, he paused for a moment. He blinked as if he couldn't understand this sentence. Until Nuwa Iyer turned her face away with a pained expression, Luo Ya slightly recovered. Luo Ya. Chapter 577. A Letter to Miss? From the Master's Side? I understand. Thank you for your hard work. Please have a good rest. With her back facing the soldiers who were arranged to rest by the guards, the black-haired maid sighed silently. She felt a headache because of what had happened in the past 6 months. It was at that time that the patriarch of the Sorophia family, Bruce, made a shocking decision. That was to transfer Xia Luot, who was handling domestic affairs in the rear, to the front line as a general of the joint army and directly participate in the battle. This could also be said to be the beginning of everything. Bruce forced Xia Luot to join the army. This seemed to be to take the lead, but in fact, he had to do so for other reasons. Gulacy, who spent every day with Xia Luot, knew this very well. It's Miss Gulacy. Open the gate. No, no, no. Last time on the battlefield, it was all thanks to you stopping her. Otherwise, young mistress, yes, I misspoke. Please don't mind. The black-haired maid and the young lady of the Sorophia family were the two commanders in this Richard Castle. They were also two masters of Source Level 2 who were officially awarded the title of general by the joint army. However, it had to be said that the two gave off completely different feelings. At this time, Miss should have woken up, Sir Gulacy. Miss Yaluot is not here. After nodding with some frustration, the maid turned around and continued to walk into the castle. Gulacy quickly walked to the room where Xia Luot was and waved his hand to signal the maid at the door to leave. He reached out and gently pushed the door open, but just as he opened a gap, a strong smell of alcohol rushed out of the room. On the ground, several bottles of different colors were casually thrown on the carpet. Even the lids were not tightly closed. Looking at the famous wine thrown on the ground, the black-haired maid showed a melancholy look on her face. However, after a moment of hesitation, she closed the door again and stood at the door sighing silently. Love destroys people. This was what many ancient poets once said, and for the current Xia Luot Sorophia, this sentence was perfect. However, no one would have thought that the young girl who grew up because of love would eventually collapse because of love. As a fiancée, she did not help her lover. This fact made Xia Luot feel very guilty. However, the young girl could only endure the worry and wait for Luo Ya's return. But with the passage of time and the news from the Knight's country, the young girl's situation began to change. After discovering this, Bruce immediately ordered for Charlotte to receive treatment. However, the young lady was deeply in love, and any psychological counseling was ineffective. Even Master Andrew couldn't eliminate the grief in the young lady's heart. Chapter 578. Luoya Akhat could be said to be an old diner. As a foodie, he traveled all over the world and tasted a lot of delicacies. Among them, he cared about the ingredients the most. Good ingredients could double the taste, but the young man probably never thought that he would be treated as an ingredient one day. That Nuwa Iyer, how does it taste? Looking at the soup in front of her that was made with the unique dried demon meat of the mutants and many wild vegetables, and slightly seasoned with salt, the blonde girl blinked in surprise and couldn't help but praise. No matter what, I'm still from a military family. I still have some survival skills in the wild. Didn't I make it for you before? This. Hearing the question of Nuwa Iyer, the black-haired young man's eyes wandered for a moment, but after thinking carefully for a while, he became confident again. 1 second, remember him? Really? Is that so? But twice? We are really fated with this land. 2 years ago, it was also on this land that the girl who couldn't control her bloodline was about to be devoured by the Angel King, but she was saved by the young man alone. At that time, the two of them probably didn't think that one day they would actually return to this old place. Recalling the past, the black-haired young man smiled bitterly while poking the bonfire, and Nuwa Iyer fell into silence. After a while, he said in a low voice, What are you talking about? That's because of the skill. There's no right or wrong. By the way, actually, I have one thing that I have always wanted to ask you. At that time, the Tucker Plains had the elusive fog of concealment, and there was also the threat of the mutants. Weren't you afraid when you came to me? Blinking and lowering his head to poke the bonfire, the black-haired young man recalled his thoughts at that time and said faintly, impulsive? In other words, you will give up after calming down? You mean, just based on this reason, it's too reckless. No matter what, you have to plan and gather the team. Chapter 579. Under the illumination of the setting sun, the black-haired young man held onto a slightly withered tree as he looked at the desert in front of him. Looking into the distance in the night wind, he could see the vast land. The primitive natural landscape gave Luoya a strange feeling that he had never felt before, as if he was the only one left in the world. In the end, crossing the border with more people was more dangerous. Unless there were so many refugees that a country's wall couldn't stop them, the fewer people there were, the easier it was to move and the harder it was to be discovered. Since a few days ago, Luoya had been conserving his energy. The king's blood that had been promoted to the gold grade was constantly restoring Luoya's condition. The crown's fusion with the source substance had reached the final stage. Although the connection with the ancient gods had not been completely established, the use of the crown stone was no longer a problem. Under the afterglow of the setting sun, the young man muttered softly as he looked at the freezing air around his arm that froze the nearby leaves. He nodded silently and felt a lot more at ease in his heart. With this kind of strength, although it was impossible to compete with the king of the race, it wasn't difficult to cross the desert. On the other hand, after the projection disappeared, Nuwa Iyer, who had returned to the human side, had probably announced the young man's plan. The relevant rescue operation would also be launched. Thinking so, the young man hesitated at the edge of the desert. After a moment, he decided to temporarily rest for the night. After all, compared to the current environment, the desert's conditions at night were more unbearable. Remember in a second. Yesterday morning, after the short blade skill of the saint was dispelled, the golden-haired angel's consciousness immediately returned to her body. When she opened her eyes, she saw layers of enchantments and the priests protecting her in the center. Grandpa, Luoya is in the depths of the Tark Plains. I beg you to immediately. Through the projection, St. John comforted the girl who was worried about Luoya and asked for detailed information about the young man. Correspondingly, Nuwa Iyer also learned about the Vatican's plan and St. John's decision. The existence of the mutants' king made everyone fearful, which was also the reason why the humans were in a disadvantageous position on the battlefield. However, after weighing the pros and cons of rescuing Luoya, Holy See John decided to carry it out. The reason was simple. In Holy See John's opinion, the humans couldn't afford to lose the possessor of the king's blood. If the king of the mutants really awakened and led his army to attack the humans again, then the humans who were at a disadvantage in terms of combat power would definitely be at a disadvantage and might even face the extinction of their race. Since quality wasn't good enough, they would make up for it with quantity. This was the best method that the humans could come up with. Under this guidance, Nuwa Iyer of the Saint Maester Theocracy, Xia Luod of the Rose Commercial United Nations, Lillian of the Austin Empire, and many other rising stars of the Golden Generation became the focus of the humans. The mutants were waiting for the absolute king of their race to awaken, while the humans were accumulating strength. This was why the war between both sides was much calmer than it was a year ago. However, Luo Ya's reappearance changed Holy See John's mind. Although no one knew about it now, as the only person who awakened the king's blood, Luo Ya was known as the special existence of the king's blood in ancient records. She was the supervisor of all races in ancient times, and was also one of the embodiments of Shi Ya's authority and strength. The moment her strength reached level 1 of the source level, no other race could be compared to her. On the other hand, even if the Holy See had to bear the responsibility of the entire human race, Holy See John couldn't abandon the only descendant of his family for hundreds of years as a king. And as an elder, he couldn't personally ruin his granddaughter's lifelong happiness. In order to get support for the joint operation, Holy See John had sent letters to the chairman of the Scholar Country, Antonio, the president of the Rose Commercial United Nations, Bruce, and the king of the Night Country, Friedrich. A large-scale, multinational rescue operation was about to begin. However, the Austin Empire was excluded, and the reason was simple. In response to Nuwa Iyer's inquiry, Holy See John gave such an answer with a solemn expression. The young lady also expressed her confidence. However, Nuwa Iyer didn't expect that a letter from Xia Luo would complicate everything. Chapter 580. The moment the crimson flames appeared, a ray of light flashed across the sky. The compressed lava turned into a spear of light that burned everything and shot towards the darkness in the distance. The enemy's strength was beyond imagination. Not only that, but they also had a level 1 source rank ally, and the mutants' army all over the land. The black-haired young man was facing the entire mutant race alone. This was undoubtedly a fantasy. Under such circumstances, the only thing Luoya could do was to kill the leader. Molten Core. This was a new ability that Luoyu obtained in this historical fragment. It was the manifestation of Mr. Darkness, a calamity that represented volcanoes and earth. Even though Luoya had only obtained it for a short period of time, there was one thing that the black-haired young man was certain of, and that was the power of this ability. At this moment, the lava that could destroy everything was the best choice. Most importantly, it belonged to the power of 6 calamities. It was a part of Shi Ya's power in ancient times, and it was also an unstoppable punishment. Boom! The arm of the gigantic mutant writhed in the smoke formed by volcanic ash, appearing and disappearing from time to time. In the distance, the black-haired young man panted slightly as he observed the movements in the smoke. His golden eyes were filled with vigilance. The king of mutants. That was an existence above the king of races. Its strength was unpredictable. Not only Luoya, but even the entire human race knew nothing about it. Because of this, Luoya's first priority was to gather basic information. In the smoke, the giant mutant's arm constantly waved, stirring up gusts of wind. Under this kind of movement, the smoke gradually dispersed, and Luoya finally had the chance to see the state of the mutants on the horizon. But what he didn't expect was that the result was completely unacceptable. Looking at the tall and strong male mutant standing on the shoulder of the giant mutant and looking down at them, the black-haired young man's golden pupils suddenly contracted. The sense of danger in his heart rose rapidly. The power of the 6 disasters was almost impossible to defend against. Whether it was curse resistance or reincarnation, even if the body was made of liquid, it should be impossible to avoid being burned. The proof was that at this moment, the king of the Source Rank 1 race, who was known for its invulnerability and almost absolute defense, had half of the scales on the front of its body burned, and it was roaring like crazy. The deafening roar spread in the desert. The black-haired young man stared at the enemy in the distance with a heavy expression. However, contrary to his thoughts, the curse power in Luo Ya's body flowed faster and faster, and the crown stone in his body also changed accordingly, blooming different colors. Frozen earth. The drifting volcanic smoke dissipated in an instant. The burning flames also disappeared silently. The gigantic mutant's mangled body stiffened in an instant. The seemingly fearless mutant king's body was also buried in the overwhelming frost. Luo Ya thought so, and waited nervously for the movement in front of him. However, everything that happened next was far beyond the young man's expectations, and it even reached a level that Luo Ya couldn't understand. The overwhelming cold, the gradually solidifying lava, the floating smoke, and the splashing sand. In an instant, everything from the other side of the horizon to Luo Ya disappeared without a trace. Only the yellow sand was left floating in the air. The black-haired young man's serious expression turned into shock, and his mind went blank. Such a question appeared in Luo Ya's mind at this moment, but it was too late to find the answer. On the other side, the king of races on the giant monster's arm had once again stretched out its hand, and this time its target was the black-haired young man. At this moment, Luo Ya's brain was spinning rapidly. Under a strong sense of crisis, his survival instinct made him subconsciously choose the strongest defense. His thin and weak body instantly burst out countless wind mist, protecting himself. The sweeping wind mist blew across the desert, and the ultra-long-distance twilight wind formed an absolute defense. At this moment, Luo Ya was almost fearless, but the habit of controlling the young man's body subconsciously made a dodging action. But what Luo Ya never thought was that this dodging action would save his life. When his body landed on the ground again, Luo Ya couldn't even stand still. While retreating step by step, the young man with blood flowing from the corner of his mouth was stunned for a moment, and finally understood what happened in that short moment. Staring at the enemy in the distant wind mist, Luo Ya's vision blurred. In that indescribable still world, the enemy dug out a part of his body. This was a fact, but Luo Ya found it hard to accept. From the outside, there didn't seem to be any problem, but from the inside, the black-haired young man was severely injured. Nearly half of his heart was gone, and the black-haired young man almost lost consciousness. Under such damage, the indestructible body skill was immediately activated, and Luo Ya's body began to overheat and overload, entering an unimaginable recovery stage. Violent coughs accompanied the awakening of his body. Under the surge of the curse power, the damaged heart rapidly shrank and began to form a new structure under the operation of the curse power, temporarily supporting the young man's body. On the other side, the rapidly increasing blood supply made Luo Ya's brain instantly awake. That attack, it's not a curse. As long as it was a curse attack, no matter what kind of attack it would be affected by the twilight wind. Especially for such a long-distance attack with such terrifying lethality, it was almost impossible to activate it under the interference of time. If it wasn't a curse, then there was only one possibility that could accurately injure Luo Ya under such conditions. After realizing this, Luo Ya's sense of crisis increased sharply. He immediately decided to retreat, but in the midst of his rapid retreat, the young man looked at the mutant king in the distance. He didn't know when the monster had raised its hand again, but the flow of time also slowed down. At this moment, Luo Ya's golden pupils suddenly shrank. He felt as if a cold wind blew past his neck. The threat of death made the young man's back shiver. However, the countless experiences of surviving in the face of death made him instantly explode. Sensing that the enemy's attack was about to descend, the young man sped up and chanted the name of the skill. Under extreme anger, he launched a counterattack. In the midst of a roar, Luo Ya's body burned up. A large amount of volcanic ash and lava exploded around him like a huge flower. The smoke of the petals shrouded his body, and the flame in the center of the flower suddenly burst out after a flash. In the midst of the deafening sound, the impact of the lava was like a giant's fist. It climbed up to the sky and then swung down on the two mutants. The huge pressure was far greater than Luo Ya's first attack. In the face of the power from 6 disasters. The mutant king was also moved for the first time. It had to change its target. Bang! All attacks were planned. This was the principle that Luoya had always followed, and the current situation was the same. With the counterattack of the mutant king, the lava fire had completely exploded. Thick volcanic ash drifted everywhere, and Luoya's figure was also covered. The barrier of the twilight wind made the opponent unable to catch up for a short period of time. Such a thought appeared in the young man's mind. The quickly retreating Luoya accelerated again. He clenched his fists and tried to keep himself awake, but his face didn't look relaxed. Because of the scenes of the previous battle, the black-haired young man had a lot of dissonance in his heart. The mutants pay attention to martial ethics? Don't bully with numbers? This is obviously impossible. Wait, motionless? This is... One of them was a mutant with a neck twice as long as the average mutant, a pair of huge wings on his back, and gray skin. 2 source-level ones, the kings of the mutants race. The mutant king. It wasn't because it underestimated Luoya that it let him go so easily, but because it knew from the beginning that Luoya couldn't escape at all. Because the previous battle, to a certain extent, was a trap. The purpose was probably to buy time for the mutants' army and the other 2 mutant kings to arrive. 3 mutant kings, tens of thousands of elites. Looking at the approaching demons in the distance, the expression on Luoya's face slowly calmed down. His golden eyes lit up, revealing a resolute gaze. Seeing such a young man, the winged mutants roared, and the sword-wielding warriors were ready to attack. In the distant team, many soldiers clenched their weapons, and the priests raised their staffs to the sky. The tense situation was about to be triggered, and the battle that would decide life and death was about to begin. In the distant sky, a light began to flicker, and it was rapidly approaching the desert. Chapter 581. In the middle of the desert, a black-haired young man stood in the middle of the desert with his hand on his chest. Powerful enemies and war drums were beating in all directions. Under the fluttering flags, the mutated people were making strange cries, and the chanting of the priests was all over the place. 3 source-level First Kings. Such a lineup was rare, and the humans had never seen such a lineup in the past. This was because the kings of different tribes were likely to be enemies with each other, and working together to defeat the enemy was almost impossible. This was also the reason why the humans were able to defeat them one by one in the past. 9 deaths and 1 life. In a sense, this was an extremely optimistic statement. It was more likely that this was the place where the young man would die. Before parting ways with Nuwa Iyer, Luoya had said that they would meet again soon and that he would definitely return. However, at this moment, the young man had to admit that he might never be able to fulfill his promise. Under the distant sky, the roars of the hybrids could be heard from the opposite side of the wind mist. The roars seemed to cause the sky to change color, and under the strange ability of the hybrid's king, the twilight wind mist quickly dissipated. The huge figure approached step by step, gradually revealing itself, and with the roar of the earth, it blocked Luoya's last escape route. The hybrids in all directions stopped, the soldiers stopped shouting, and the priests no longer spoke. They all looked at the figure on the shoulder of the huge monster. The vast desert was silent for a moment, and only the wind and sand were still blowing. The moment the 2 gazes met, Luoya's body tensed up, and he was ready to deal with the strange attack. However, the tall and strong hybrid's king did not raise his deadly arms, nor did he immediately order an attack. Instead, he opened his mouth and spoke a strange language. In the calm voice, a wave of ancient and complex language was heard. It was a foreign language that Luoya had never heard of before, but the black-haired young man could understand it, because the moment the language entered his ears, the corresponding meaning would appear in his mind, and the content was very simple. King Selection. This title had long disappeared with the passage of time, and the glory of the King Selection race was no longer there. However, for an ancient existence, the person who possessed the bloodline of the overseer granted by Shia would always be the most troublesome existence, and also a problem that must be solved. The young man's affirmative words came out from his mouth, and the alien king in the distance responded with silence. After a moment, He said, I see. I didn't expect that after so many years, the one who finally remembers us is actually the enemy. Shiya's power is always so dazzling. You were sent here by my ally, and it's your destiny to be killed by me. Hearing the words of the hybrid's king, the black-haired young man raised his eyebrows and smiled. Looking at the ugly expression of the mutant king, the fearless young man mocked him without holding back. Madness and depravity are only the price. When he returns, everything will change. Chapter 582. In the desert, the horns of the various tribes sounded at the same time. Some of the horns were loud enough to make one's blood boil, while some were low enough to make one's impetuous. Dozens of different sounds mixed together to form a symphony of destruction. The chosen king was an existence that had to be killed even if one had to pay a terrible price. It was also the last gem that Shiya had left behind in the world after countless years. His power was worth the deaths of so many warriors, and the kings of the various races had also paid the price in the previous battle. As the kings of their races, perhaps they would firmly carry out the orders of the mutant's king, but the price wouldn't be their lives. As for the enemies who were more severely injured than them, the human wave tactic was the smallest loss in their eyes. The second unfair battle began. The situation of 1 against 3 worsened, and Luo Ya's situation became more and more dangerous. Although the indestructible body skill was still active, the young man could no longer feel his own body. The Twilight Wind had been deactivated due to the exhaustion. The reign of the curse of death had also entered a temporary cooldown. Only the young man who was surrounded by frost and lava began to fight with the least amount of strength. In the midst of a bestial roar, the first level 2 source chosen swung his blade at Luo Ya. The sharp blade was aimed at the young man's neck. Facing such an attack, Luo Ya gritted his teeth and forced himself to use his strength. This was the value of the existence of low-level transcendence on the battlefield. Using a large number of transcendence in exchange for the enemy's exhaustion to increase the chances of victory. And under such a guiding ideology and the fearless soldiers' attacks, as time passed, Luo Ya gradually approached his limit. The battle in the real world was not a legend, nor was it a story in a picture book. The reason why Luo Ya could fight against 10,000 enemies was because of the nature of his strength and the amount of curse power he possessed. But even so, he could no longer hold on. The fierce battle consumed a lot of energy, and the situation of not being able to make ends meet began to appear. The young man who was immersed in the slaughter did not know anything else. Almost an hour later, the desert was completely silent, and the scenery had completely changed. After a brief respite, Luo Ya's mind cleared up slightly. He raised his head and stood on top of the mountain of corpses, looking around. What he saw was the desert filled with corpses, as well as the trembling soldiers who were looking at the youth with fear in their eyes. He was like an immortal monster, but also like a person blessed by the god of war. When he stood on top of thousands of corpses, even the most courageous soldiers lost the courage to wield their swords. After countless battles, the young man's body was covered with countless wounds of various sizes. 3 broken swords were stuck in his back, and a short spear was stuck in his left leg. His body was stained with blood, and his face was blurred under the overflowing curse power. Only his eyes were still shining. An eerie silence began to spread on the battlefield. The kings of the races were hesitant, and the soldiers were scared out of their wits. It was not until the king of the mutants urged them to attack from afar that the 3 monsters began to attack again. A war of attrition. This was a trick that the enemies came up with. Although it was despicable, it was effective. Boom. When everything calmed down again, and the wind and sand dissipated, the mountain of corpses and the sea of blood that was left behind by the previous battle had disappeared. Countless pieces of flesh and blood were scattered all over the ground. The black-haired young man's figure was no longer conspicuous. Instead, he leaned against a giant rock. His hand was holding onto his weapon, and his body was stiff but tenacious. Under countless attacks and fierce battles, indestructible body's recovery could no longer keep up with the damage. life towards death, had been pushed to the limit under the repeated attacks. Luoya had used up all his trump cards. Chapter 584. What was the purpose of this battle that could even be considered as a war? It wasn't hard for the initiator of this entire incident to answer this question. For the king of the mutants who lived from ancient times to the present, this was a goal that must be achieved. Even if the girl in front of Roja broke through the first level of the source level and became a saint with a sword, at this moment, she was almost invincible. More importantly, although the sacred sword was powerful, it was far less of a threat to the fallen mutants than the crown stone, which was closer to Shiya's strength. And the proof was the current performance of the kings of the races. The king whose blade was shattered stood up and grabbed the soldier's weapon. He looked at the girl who was on the verge of collapsing, his eyes filled with excitement and murderous intent to challenge the limits of the sword. But even so, Wilhelmina was a variable that the king of the mutants didn't want to see. Therefore, he had no choice but to join this dishonorable battle himself. It's over. The dazzling holy sword was brandished for the second time, and a flash of light cut the body of the mutant king in half. It paused for a moment before crumbling into black sludge. On the other side, Wilhelmina's body trembled violently as she fell into the young man's arms. Luoya, who caught the girl's body, couldn't help but exclaim in shock. But at the next moment, Luoya saw the body of the blue-haired girl. At this moment, the black-haired young man finally understood why the mutants didn't make a move. Normally, she wouldn't be able to wield a sword with this kind of injury. She should have died before Roja, but with this kind of body, she was able to fight until now. Looking at Wilhelmina in this state, Luoya's mind went blank. His body trembled uncontrollably. However, the blue-haired girl wasn't sad. She looked at the young man and apologized softly. As a warrior, Luoya could accept dying alone in the enemy's camp like a hero, but he couldn't accept the fact that someone important died in front of him to save him. To the young man, this pain and sorrow was far worse than death. It was also something that he couldn't accept or compromise with. Hugging the blue-haired girl's body, the black-haired young man who was covered in blood widened his eyes and made up his mind. But the enemy didn't give Luoya much time. They didn't dare to be careless when facing the two of them who were on the verge of death. The strange bird in the sky roared with thunder, the three-armed giant mutants stood up, and the king of the races with a sword was approaching rapidly. After displaying such talent and strength, both Luoya and Wilhelmina were on the must-kill list of the mutants. Without receiving the order from the king of the mutants, the three kings of the races pounced on them. They knew that they had to keep the two of them here. Once the two of them returned to the human camp, the consequences would be unimaginable. To the two of them who were on the verge of death, this could be said to be a desperate situation. Facing such a situation, the black-haired young man had no other choice. Using Wilhelmina's scattered curse as the raw material, the young man lit up the final crown stone. Floating silver mist emerged from Luoya's body. Looking at the silver mist, Luoya, who was hugging the girl, remained calm. He spoke softly and gave his last order. It was also the biggest gamble of his life. After receiving the order, the silver mist surged faster. Under the illumination of various colors, it opened its mouth and swallowed the two of them. Chapter 585. Luoya Akat didn't like to take risks. This was a well-known fact among those around him. It was also a habit that he had cultivated over the years to survive. But it must be emphasized that this wasn't an ironclad rule. When the young lady confessed her love for him, Luoya knew that he couldn't lose her. He was willing to pay any price for it. After pondering for a while, the black-haired young man found his answer. As long as both of them had the same physique, Luoya's strong regenerative heart had the possibility of reactivating the young lady's heart. This was the only way to save Wilhelmina from the clutches of death. But the moment he thought of this method, Luoya was faced with a problem. In the previous battle, Luoya's heart had half of it removed by the mutant's king. Even until now, it hadn't recovered. Under such circumstances, removing a part of his heart was undoubtedly suicidal. Even Luoya himself was surprised at the madness of this plan. But after some consideration, the black-haired young man decisively chose to carry it out. "Mother, I'm sorry, but please bless me." Dizziness, tinnitus, and coldness assaulted the black-haired young man. His body that was already on the verge of death began to decline rapidly. But even so, the young man who hugged the young lady continued to remove a quarter of his heart with trembling hands. Beat. Success. Did I win the bet? Facts had proven that a mother's love was great. Mother Goddess didn't skimp on the slightest when she reconstructed the body for her beloved child. This indestructible body, that was forged using thousands of years of treasures from various races, had exceeded the limits of a human. And Luoya had indeed relied on this to overcome many difficulties. Feeling the soft heartbeat of Wilhelmina in his embrace, the black-haired young man revealed a smile. Wilhelmina survived, and Luoya didn't die because of his heart. This could be said to be the best ending that the young man could think of. But it had to be said that everything wasn't over yet. Corroding time breath and devour silver mist were not used much, but the side effects of touch of frozen earth and molten core had begun to appear when the teenager was unconscious. Luoya's body had since turned into a battlefield of ice and fire. Wilhelmina's heart was indeed the biggest problem, but other than that, her injuries were just as severe. She had a hideous wound on her chest, burned internal organs, and pierced by broken pieces of her armor. The dragon bloodline's mediocre recovery ability made all of these injuries worse, which would eventually lead to her death. After confirming the plan that he made before he fainted, the black-haired young man forced himself to sit up. He did not know how long he had been unconscious in the dark stone room, but the blood on the ground had not completely dried up. After roughly estimating how long she had been unconscious, Luoya looked at the girl beside him. Perhaps it was because the young man's heart was much faster than Wilhelmina's body. The wound on the girl's chest healed faster than other parts of her body. I see. Is it the will of the sword? But no matter what, since the girl had removed the negative effects, the most dangerous injury was no longer a threat. Luoya began to face the second problem, which was the burned internal organs of the girl. Conventional methods could no longer work, but it was also wrong to say that Luoya was completely helpless. After all, according to his previous experience with the heart, Luoya only needed to cut the liver, spleen, lungs, and kidneys once to reactivate Wilhelmina's internal organs. But the problem was that if Wilhelmina survived after a few cuts, Luoya would have to die. Feeling his weak body, the black-haired young man shook his head. He knew that he could no longer accurately cut out the kidneys. On the other hand, Luoya did not dare to share the organs with the girl. The reason was simple: the rejection reaction. Right now, Wilhelmina was still in a state of near death. Her strength was still too weak, so the rejection reaction had not happened yet. Once her injuries recovered, the situation would definitely worsen. At that time, her internal organs would reject her, and it would be a life-threatening crisis. After Mother Goddess's painstaking transformation, Luoya's body could be said to be full of treasures. Not only his heart, but even his blood contained the blood race's primordial blood. Although the amount was not too high, its recovery ability was very significant. On the other hand, compared to the organs, blood was much safer, especially for the kings of the Source Rank 1 races. Basically, human blood could be absorbed into the body. The moment the blood dripped onto Wilhelmina's burned body, her body that had reached the Source Rank 1 began to automatically absorb the sudden source of energy. Luoya could clearly feel that the curse power in Wilhelmina's body became more active, and the recovery speed of her body was much faster than before. After persevering for a few minutes, the black-haired young man muttered to himself. His vision turned black, and he once again fell into a coma. When Luoya woke up for the second time, his condition was not much better compared to the first time. In fact, the condition of his body had worsened. Fortunately, after fusing his soul with the 6 disasters, Luoya had a strong resistance to the side effects. Even in such a situation, as long as he clenched his teeth, he could temporarily hold on. After sensing his own condition, the black-haired young man stood up again and checked the condition of the girl he cared about the most. But fortunately, it was not without good news. When he approached the girl, Luoya discovered that he could already hear Wilhelmina's light breathing. The moment he noticed this, Luoya's heart couldn't help but be excited because this meant that the girl's lungs had obviously improved. Under the black-haired young man's efforts, Wilhelmina, who was breathing and had a heartbeat, was basically saved. The only thing left to worry about was her brain. Luoya's rescue was carried out after the girl's breath dissipated for dozens of seconds. Although during that period of time, the young man didn't stop transferring vitality, but even so, Luoya still couldn't guarantee that the girl's brain didn't suffer any damage. Muttering so, the black-haired young man caressed the girl's cheek. His face revealed a slight sorrow, but he immediately shook his head and pulled himself together. Clenching his teeth, he stood up and began the last task of his plan. In the previous battle, the girl's armor that blocked Luoya's joint attack was shattered. The resulting fragments turned into sharp blades that pierced into the girl's body, causing secondary damage. After straightening Wilhelmina's body, the black-haired young man stared at the messy clothes that covered her upper body for a moment. Then, he stretched out his hand and tore the clothes into pieces and threw them aside. Looking clean from the inside out, this sentence was perfect to describe what Luoya did to the girl. After sweeping away the last obstacle, Luoya finally began his work. One had to admit that this was a rather time-consuming task. There were dozens of armor fragments piercing into Wilhelmina's body. The small ones were fine as they only injured her flesh, but the bigger ones pierced into her internal organs. It was very troublesome. Although the frozen touch's cold air was used as a weapon most of the time, it could actually achieve a numbing effect in a very small amount. Although the girl shouldn't be able to feel the pain, Luoya still couldn't bear to do this surgery without doing anything. She couldn't sleep yet. After spending more than a day, the black-haired young man finally completed his task. As for the rest of the time, Luoya could only leave it to fate and Wilhelmina. He prayed that the girl would be able to overcome this obstacle and wake up completely. Reaching out his hand to caress the girl's pale face, Luoya's eyes were filled with heartache and tenderness. The exhausted young man looked at Wilhelmina for a long time before finally leaning against the wall and falling asleep. Not long after he fell asleep, the unconscious girl murmured in her sleep, "Luoya." After calming down, Luoya couldn't help but recall the previous dream. He shook his head slightly and looked at the young lady in his arms with a solemn expression. The reason was simple. It was because the previous dream was too realistic. Could it be because of your heart? Were those your dreams? Now that the connection between the two was infinitely close due to the heart, blood, and other factors, the curse power of the two in their dreams could possibly affect the dream. If Luoya's dream really belonged to the girl, it meant that there was nothing wrong with Wilhelmina's brain. She might even wake up after Luoya. Luoya. When Wilhelmina's whisper entered his ears and her orange eyes opened again, Luoya didn't even have time to react. He looked at the girl and his heartbeat quickened. The excitement in his heart couldn't be described with words. After thinking for a moment, the black-haired girl replied with a slightly choked voice. Chapter 587. Rejection was undoubtedly a life-threatening reaction. Even Wilhelmina, who had reached Source Rank 1, didn't dare to say that she could overcome this reaction. But facing the choice given by Luoya, the girl resolutely chose the second option. The reason was simple. The second option was risky and the success rate wasn't high, but once it succeeded, Wilhelmina's body would no longer have any hidden dangers. The recovery ability of Source Rank 1 would be fully unleashed. With the help of her heart, the girl's injuries would be healed in a few days. Most importantly, Luoya's burden would be greatly reduced. That was, the boy's injuries didn't improve at all. Luoya's hands were cold, even colder than the heavily injured Wilhelmina. And in terms of heartbeat, Luoya's situation was even worse. The girl in his arms could clearly feel that the boy's heartbeat was even weaker than an ordinary person without supernatural powers. But apart from that, there were some things that Wilhelmina didn't want to change. Is this the encouragement you were talking about? Looking at Wilhelmina, who made a rather cute request, Luoya couldn't help but bitterly smile. But after thinking about it carefully, he felt that it wasn't surprising. She was simple and clumsy, and she didn't know how to act coquettishly. After all, according to Wilhelmina's father, Friedrich's training method, the girl didn't have anyone to act coquettishly with. Once she showed it, she would be criticized as weak. Is this okay? Will your body hurt? Ah, that. I tore it off when I was treating your wounds. Hearing Luo Ya's explanation, the gray-blue-haired girl went silent for a moment before replying. Her pale cheeks flushed red, and the black-haired boy was speechless for a moment. I'm sorry, I didn't ask for your permission. What do you mean? What are you talking about? If there was someone in the world who understood a girl's body the most, it would be the black-haired boy who bore the brunt of it. Thus, he had the most right to speak about Wilhelmina's feminine charms. Supple and smooth skin, well-developed and tall breasts, a slim waist without a trace of excess fat, and a perky but that was exceptionally charming. She had a devilish figure. Compared to the nobles who lived like princes, the young lady's body was almost perfect. Really? If that's the case, that's good. Chapter 588. In the room filled with the aroma of wine, the black-haired boy stared at the handwriting on the wine barrel in front of him. He stood there in a daze for a moment, then he suddenly raised his hand and cast an illumination spell. The surprised expression on Luo Ya's face slowly calmed down and was replaced by a dignified expression. After standing there and thinking for a while, the black-haired boy walked into the depths of the wine cellar and found that although the wine on the wine rack was of different years, the column where it was brewed was the same. Now that things had come to this, the black-haired youth had no choice but to admit the fact that the building he was now in, the massive fortress, was the Tak Fortress, an important stronghold of the theocracy that had gone missing years ago. It was a gathering of 100,000 elites and many high-tier extraordinary individuals. Hidden Fog, that was the most mature and most terrifying 6 disasters that Luoya had ever seen. It was also a monster that the boy didn't want to face even if he reached source level 2. However, the reality now was that Luoya was likely to be in its territory. Thinking of this, Luoya raised his eyebrows speechlessly, and a strong worry rose in his heart for a while. 1 second, remember this time. Luoya took the risk to use Devourer of the Silver Fog to devour him without being discovered. The boy thought that there should be 2 reasons. The first reason was naturally that the time was too short. Devourer of the Silver Fog only took a few seconds from use to deactivation. The second reason was that Luoya and Wilhelmina's condition was too bad. Suddenly there was a source level 1 and a source level 2 in their stomach. No matter how slow Hidden Fog was, it would notice it sooner or later. At that time, it would definitely take action against them. In other words, Luoya and Wilhelmina's time here was not infinite. The further they stayed, the more dangerous it would be. When Hidden Fog devoured Tucker Fortress, there were more than 100,000 people stationed there, but now Luoya couldn't see a single person. Not to mention other things, the state of this wine cellar was very strange. It had to be said that this situation was too abnormal and unrealistic. In Luoya's opinion, it was a little strange. However, if he wanted to know the truth, he would have to leave the underground facility and explore the surface, which was a little unrealistic for the current youth. After understanding this, Luoya immediately took action. He pulled the bag aside and filled it with a dozen bottles of good fruit wine. Then he opened the door and cast the illumination spell again. Quietly walking into the house and closing the door, Luoya leaned against the wall and slowly sat down, slightly relieved. He arranged Hydra to guard one side, then looked at the gray-blue-haired girl and fell into deep thought. When the time comes, with the support of the ancient gods, it wouldn't be a problem for them to recover their combat strength. However, at that time, in order to avoid being discovered by Hidden Fog, Luoya and Wilhelmina would have to leave. After returning, they would probably still land in the desert where they left. The two of them couldn't fight a war against another race, especially under the premise that the other side had the existence of the mutants' king. It was inevitable that they would need support. According to the previous schedule, in 2 days' time, Luoya and Nua Iyer would rendezvous. 2 days' time. Huh? Let's hope that more people will come. The black-haired youth began to recover his body in his sleep. In the distant fortress, a girl looked at the letter on the table and frowned strangely. In the eastern front line, Fort Noise belonging to the Austin Empire. The black-haired, purple-eyed girl frowned and looked at the letter on the table in front of her silently. On the side, the maid Audrey was arranging the table while paying attention to the movements of Her Royal Highness. Chapter 589. Lillian was a genius. Be it in the past or present, this was something that all teachers of any subject would recognize. The letter sent by Nua Iyer was undoubtedly laughable if one were to consider it solely from a military perspective. One might even suspect that it was purposely trying to make things difficult for Audrey, which was why Audrey expressed her disgust. But after careful consideration, Lillian felt that something was amiss. So if one were to eliminate the possibility of Nua Iyer stirring up trouble and look at the letter without prejudice, one would be able to discover a lot of problems. Your Highness, do you mean that this letter wasn't written by the princess? A hint? Even though Nua Iyer's letter was simple and clear, the language style was poles apart from the usual. Yet, it was written by the young lady herself, which was something that bothered Lillian a lot. After giving it some thought, the young lady could only think of one possibility. As for the reason, Lillian had more or less guessed it. It was likely that the Austin Empire was monitoring Lillian. Her Highness the Empress's battle achievements were outstanding, and she had become an indispensable force in the alliance. Unless the mutants were wiped out, it was almost impossible to touch her on the surface. But one of the consequences of the apparent unity between the two sides was that the Austin Empire's surveillance of Lillian was getting stricter. The conflict between Lucas and Lillian, as well as the surveillance of the Austin Empire's spy system, was something that the Nua Iyer, as the princess and successor of the theocracy, was definitely aware of. That was why she used this method to hint that Lillian had something that she couldn't disclose. But even so, the black-haired, purple-eyed young lady still couldn't make a decision easily. No, Your Highness. There hasn't been any information about this operation leaked. The young lady narrowed her purple eyes as she muttered to herself. She felt that the situation was getting increasingly strange. The maid beside her also fell into deep thought. What exactly is the theocracy of Saint Maester trying to do? Your Highness, the surveillance of our country is getting tighter. If we send out troops rashly, it is likely to provoke His Majesty and cause trouble for our future operations. So, what you mean is, upon hearing Lillian's thoughts, Audrey couldn't help but widen her eyes in shock. Even though Lillian didn't turn out in full force, sending out such a core force was enough to show her sincerity. Frankly speaking, Audrey felt that sending out 100,000 elite troops based on a single letter was too much of a reaction. But looking at Lillian, who had made her decision, the maid didn't say anything else. Then, Your Highness, it's almost time for dinner. After dealing with the Nua Iyer's letter, the black-haired, purple-eyed girl looked at the sky outside the window. She stood up from her desk and walked to the dining table. Audrey began to serve the food that was already prepared. Due to mutation, the bodies of extraordinary individuals could survive without eating. However, the children in their wombs were born with mortal bodies. Babies who were unable to absorb magic essence could only rely on food for nourishment. This situation could not be changed, and the only thing Lillian could do was adapt. While tasting the food in her mouth, Lillian's expression remained unchanged, but her gaze at her abdomen became gentler. Audrey, who stood at the side, finally felt relieved and asked about her recent feelings. Your Highness, have you been feeling unwell recently? If so, please tell me in time so that I can deal with it. I feel like my spell power has been lacking recently. Literally. The consumption is greater than in the past, and I haven't found the reason. Even though Lillian was powerful, her physical condition had been unstable in the past year. Compared to various other problems, the lack of spell power wasn't a big deal at all. Besides, there were many possible reasons, such as a new round of body mutation, or to make up for the wounds left behind in previous battles. Even though the other party was powerful, under the siege of Lillian's endless army of the ancient Austin Empire, the ruler of the race chose to retreat. But in this battle, the young lady's arm was slightly injured. At this thought, Audrey wasn't nervous. But with the principle of being cautious, the maid decided to go through the procedures seriously. Yes, I'm almost done with today's official business. Don't worry. Usually, before going to bed, Her Highness would read some literature. This had always been her hobby, but for some reason, she felt a little uneasy today. In the distance, the soldiers on the city walls guarded the city in silence under the illumination of the torches. Their gazes toward the plains were meticulous. The sound of the patrol's boots landing on the ground was uniform as though they were soldiers being inspected. Lillian, who stood high above, looked at the scene and nodded in satisfaction. Then, she gazed at the stars in the sky in silence. Perhaps it was related to her, or the people around her. In such a situation, the success rate was at least 50%. It was due to this reason that Lillian didn't dare to be careless. She walked out of the room and checked the surroundings. In other words, is the problem on my side? Recently, Lillian had been feeling that the spell power in her body was inexplicably draining away. She had mentioned this to Audrey. But what the young lady didn't mention was that she had a vague feeling that the spell power in her body wasn't draining away. Instead, it was being devoured. Gazing at the vast night sky, the black-haired, purple-eyed young lady's eyes glinted with worry. She pondered over the problem in her mind and subconsciously placed her hand on her abdomen. This unborn little life seemed to be a little unusual. When a human baby was in its mother's body, it could only survive on the nutrients and energy brought by ordinary food and couldn't absorb the spell power formed by magic elements. This was an iron law since ancient times, and also the reason why Lillian had to eat every day. In the beginning, Lillian thought that it was because of the king's blood, but she quickly denied this possibility. After all, putting aside the fact that the king's blood had always needed to be awakened, even her parents, Luoya and Lillian, were only ordinary people when they were born. Giants, dragons, angels, and other races that disappeared in ancient times grew by absorbing spell power in their embryos. They were born with extraordinary powers, which was also why they were called mythical races. But this situation obviously didn't apply to Lillian and Luoya, who were both humans. After pondering for a long time, this thought emerged in the black-haired young lady's mind. She let out a helpless sigh, turned around, and headed back to her bedroom to rest. But the moment she was about to enter her room, a faint radiance appeared behind her all of a sudden. The young lady widened her eyes abruptly. The moment she sensed the radiance, Lillian turned around abruptly. The spell power in her body erupted instantly, and the barrier against assassins expanded rapidly and shrouded her. At the same time, heavily armored knights appeared on both sides of the young lady. Ancient Austin's mages hovered in the air and filled in the gaps in the defense. At that moment, at the edge of the balcony, where Lillian stood, a figure emanating a faint radiance appeared out of nowhere. It was a young girl with her eyes shut. Her pitch-black hair fluttered in the wind. Her skin was fair, and her appearance was adorable. Despite her young age, one could already tell that she would be a devastatingly beautiful woman in the future. At this thought, the young lady's gaze sharpened. The knights around her swarmed forward immediately. At the same time, the little girl at the end of the balcony opened her eyes. Her golden eyes widened abruptly when she saw Lillian. Then, she uttered a word as if by reflex. She did it. She really did it. No, that's not right. Now isn't the time to talk about that. Staring at the little girl who was only a few years old and whose hair and pupils were almost the same color as Luoya's, Lillian, who hadn't returned to her senses from the shock, asked subconsciously. But before she spoke, the little girl suddenly yelled at her. The young lady spoke as though she wanted to tell Lillian something. But halfway through her sentence, the radiance on her body flickered and her voice was cut off. At the next moment, the young lady vanished as though she had never appeared in this world. It was at that moment that Lillian returned to her senses from her astonishment. Gazing at the empty space where the little girl vanished, Lillian stared blankly for a moment before dashing forward. However, be it the little girl or the radiance, there was nothing there. At the thought of how the little girl addressed her, the black-haired young lady couldn't help but widen her eyes again. She stood on the balcony in a daze for a moment, but at the next moment, Lillian suddenly recalled the words that the little girl left for her. If that child is real, wouldn't her so-called father be? Right now, Lillian didn't have any clues about Luoya at all. Even if she wanted to save her, where could she go? The moment she recalled the little girl's words, a strong sense of dissonance rose in Lillian's heart all of a sudden. After pondering for a moment, she turned around abruptly and looked at the room behind her. At this thought, Lillian turned around abruptly, rushed into the study, and picked up the letter on the desk. She stared at the words that she couldn't understand and her eyes glinted. Chapter 590. Indestructible Body. This was a body created by the mother goddess in the ancient times for the young man by chance. It was also the reason why Luoya didn't really die after he returned from the historical fragment. That was a deep sleep without dreams. The dark stone room didn't provide any time information to the young man's biological clock. When Luoya's consciousness floated up again, the first thing he felt was the softness under his body. Fragrance? Turning his eyes away unnaturally, the black-haired young man cursed silently in his heart. A knee pillow, and it was the knee pillow of the serious Miss Knight. He had to admit that this was beyond Luoya's expectations. However, thanks to the young lady, Luoya's mind quickly cleared up due to the rapid blood flow. The moment her orange-red eyes fell on the young man, Wilhelmina let out a sigh of relief. Then, she excitedly reached out her hand to touch the young man's cheek. Oh, that's still okay. My body is much lighter now. The wound on his back and the injury on his left leg had already healed. As for the bones in his body, most of the slight bone fractures had already healed. The remaining ones were also constantly recovering. Minna, how do you feel? No, that's why I said you don't need to thank me. It's okay. My legs didn't suffer much injuries. It won't be a burden. Also, this is one of my thanks. You're almost naked now. Not to mention that the part that covered your lower abdomen had turned into strips of cloth. There was even a hole in your chest. Coupled with the perfect body that the Miss Knight had trained for many years, that kind of half-hidden charm was really too impactful. Luoya, did you bring that wine back from the outside? I just saw it when I was drinking. It said that it was produced in Tucker Fortress. What exactly is this? Looking at the young lady who carefully said that while looking at Luoya as if she was afraid of provoking him, the black-haired young man couldn't help but fall into a short silence. It's okay. My ability to accept things is still very strong. You don't have to look at me like that. After saying that helplessly, the black-haired young man's expression turned serious. After thinking for a moment, he said softly, Chapter 591. Shiya's long-distance communication could be said to be the most expensive and most demanding way of communication in the world. Therefore, no matter what type of long-distance communication curse vessel it was, the cost was 6 digits of gold coins. It was an exclusive equipment that only the great aristocrats of various countries could have. But even with such a high price, there were often problems with communication. With this understanding, the Akhat family, which wasn't rich at all, dug out a lot of money and invested a lot in this area, making Akhat territory the second territory in the church after the royal family to have the ability to communicate with each other. Therefore, at the moment when she saw the last record on the curse vessel, Wilhelmina asked Luoya this question. However, the black-haired young man was not too surprised after a slight pause. Although Nuwa Iyer did not tell Luoya the truth at that time in order not to let the young man worry, the Holy See, who perceived the unfavorable situation, sent Luoya to Tuk Fortress. In other words, the Holy See wanted to get in touch with Luoya at that time, and this might be the record at that time. Coincidence? No, it's impossible. Hearing Luoya's explanation, the gray blue-haired girl immediately denied it, making the black-haired young man a little surprised. Seeing this, Wilhelmina was silent for a moment. Then she spoke again with a serious face. After I went missing? Wait, that means... Staring at Wilhelmina, who said so with a serious face, Luoya's body stiffened for a while. After a while, the young man's face changed suddenly. He stepped forward and looked at the last record on the curse vessel. He sorted out the girl's words in his mind, and his eyes widened uncontrollably. So, who could this person be? But after a little thought, Luoya denied this possibility, and the reason was very simple. That was, if Mother Goddess really wanted to contact, she didn't need these communication curse vessels at all, and it was impossible for her to know the equipment number of the Akkad family. After excluding the possibility of Mother Goddess, Luoya could only think of one person. Thinking of the silver-haired girl who was currently missing, Luoya's pupils suddenly shrank, and Wilhelmina also nodded slowly with a serious face. On the other hand, as the person in charge of the family's intelligence, AI Lizzie was familiar with the communication curse vessel. If she really came here, it was reasonable to use the curse vessel to contact the outside world. As for why the girl could move freely here instead of disappearing inexplicably like others, Luoya also had a guess in his mind. Thinking of this, Luoya suddenly became excited. He was stunned for a moment, then he turned around and wanted to go out to look for the girl, but Wilhelmina grabbed his arm. There are still many places I haven't been. Chapter 592. Space Curse. This has always been the goal of the Cursemancers in Shia world. However, after thousands of years, the results of countless generations of efforts were very few. Wait, Luoya, do you really want to do this? But this is too dangerous, and there is no evidence to prove that this is useful. Hearing Wilhelmina's words, Luoya couldn't help but fall into silence. But in the young man's heart, he didn't dispel the idea of doing this. This world where there was no one, and time almost stopped was only the first layer, and in the deeper part, Luoya could vaguely feel something, and it was likely to be the victims of the Tucker Fortress incident that the young man had been looking for. Luoya, my bloodline can transform into a giant dragon? Do you still remember? What if I immediately transform into a giant dragon after leaving here and fly out with you? How about this tactic? Indeed, but at that time, there will be external support, and it should be held back by the human side source level 1, in that case. After listening to Wilhelmina's plan, the black-haired young man fell into silence for a while, but after thinking for a moment, he shook his head and said the existence that made him most afraid. Although he had experienced several battles, in fact, so far, Luoya almost didn't collect any information about him, and he knew nothing about him. On the contrary, whether it was Luoya or Wilhelmina, they had been completely seen through in the previous battle, and the effect of the attack was likely to be greatly reduced. Before, the war between humans and mutants was in a relatively balanced state, but with the appearance of the mutants' king, the balance began to tilt greatly. The human side was already in a disadvantageous situation, and they must increase some chips. Thinking of this, Luoya strengthened his will, and Wilhelmina, who failed to persuade him, sighed. Looking at the black-haired young man's expression, the girl knew that her persuasion was useless, but even so, Wilhelmina still wanted to remind him. Wilhelmina, I said this not to weaken your fighting spirit, but to save the soldiers in Tucker Fortress. This is undoubtedly a magnificent feat, and whether it is successful or not, I think it is right. What I want to tell you is that I've always been with you. Hearing Wilhelmina's words, Roja's golden eyes slowly widened. The girl saw this and smiled. She came over and took Roja's hand. She looked at his eyes and said softly, Yeah, then, I'll be right back. After an emotional farewell, Luoya let go of his hand and took a step back. The crown stone in his body was once again activated and bloomed with radiance. The next moment, the drifting white mist appeared again, and covered the boy's body in an instant. Inside Tucker Fortress, a black-haired young man was hiding in the white fog. At this moment, at the edge of the Harvey Desert, inside the tents of the frontline army, a meeting was being held. The average age of the generals continued to decrease. This was no longer news. In fact, it was not just the generals. The average age of the entire Alliance army was decreasing. However, this was not a planned replacement of the old with new blood, but an inevitable result of the cruelty of war. Under such circumstances, the younger generation had no choice but to step onto the battlefield and carry the banner left by the older generation. Under the background of cruel war and the continuous increase of magic concentration, they grew up at an astonishing speed. At the front of the meeting table, an unusually tall man and a cold-looking blonde woman in armor sat on the left and right sides of the long table. They were Luo Yu's two old acquaintances, Geert Gust and Brittany Lund. The reason why they were at the front of the table was because of the rules of the Alliance army. Among the people in the meeting room, Giant Geert's assault squad was ranked first in terms of kills. His total kill count was over 30,000. The second was Valkyrie Brittany, who was also part of the assault squad. Her total kill count was over 24,000. However, compared to when they were still in the academy, whether it was Gord or Brittany, who made a lot of deals with Roja because of some hobbies, both of them were no longer as naive as they were when they were students. Behind the two of them were Berserk Beast, Selena's mountain squad with a total kill count of 20,000, and Queen of the Night, Juliana's night assault squad with a total kill count of 18,000. The 4 seats at the front were occupied by the 4 famous members of the Golden Generation. More than half of the seats at the back were occupied by familiar faces from St. Freya Academy. Many of them were even members of the Purple Rose faction that Luo Yu belonged to. Indeed, but if we want to graduate, we can't do it without the leader of Rosette Dawn, be it the former leader or the current leader. The former military advisor of Blue Rose's faction had now become a staff officer of the Joint Army's General Staff Department. Stuart, who had a unique ability, had made many contributions and became the staff officer of the Intelligence Department. However, the two of them, who held high positions, did not put on any airs when they talked. I see. You and Brittany are indeed cadres of the Leaders' Society. I seem to have helped you a lot back then. But are you getting married? You were so against it back then. The gray-haired man gazed at the young lady's blindfolded eyes and lamented in his heart. Upon hearing his words, Stuart also sensed something and didn't ask further. Instead, he turned to the crowd that was whispering to each other. Well, except for the Austin Empire's part, almost all of them are here. That's all we have right now. But everyone here is indebted to the minister. In times like this, we can still rely on our own people and have a strong will to save others. 300,000. This was the intelligence that Stuart brought to him regarding the mutants' military strength in the Harvey Desert. It was obviously more than the current human military strength of 200,000. As a staff officer, Gurok knew that this number was still increasing. Before I came here, I used my eyes to take a look. There are at least 10,000 more people every day. After hearing the latest news from Stuart, Gurok couldn't help but let out a long sigh. Even though everyone present was an elite unit of the Alliance, and Brittany and the others were a renowned trump card unit, the difference in numbers of over 100,000 was still a little too great. Is there any news from the Austin Empire? Gurok sighed and couldn't help but look at the tent at the back. Stuart followed his gaze, and both of them exchanged glances. At the same time, they silently prayed that the young ladies who were the leaders over there could bring them some good news. Gurok and Stuart placed their hopes on the two young ladies in the Alliance Army's upper echelons. However, in the tent at the back, the two famous commanders on the front lines were having an intense argument. The reason was the issue of military strength. In the most intense battle of Stanlow last year, the Alliance Army was the main force and defended against the army led by the Four Kings of the Mutants. In that battle, the Alliance Army suffered heavy casualties. John of the Holy See was also injured. On the other hand, The enemy lost one of their kings. Didn't I say it before? It doesn't matter even if you inform the Austin Empire. Otherwise, how are you going to break through the blockade of 300,000 mutants? Who can understand that kind of thing? If you tell that woman the truth, she will definitely help with all her might. In the room, Xiaoluo's body trembled slightly. She grabbed Nua Ayer's collar in anger. On the other side, the blonde girl fell into silence after hearing the elf lady's words. As the number of people involved increased, the nearing of the incident, and Xiaoluo's actions, arbiter of fate, astrology results would become inaccurate or even ineffective. In other words, for this rescue operation of Luoya, Xiaoluo's astrology results were the most accurate when she first received the news. However, what Xiaoluo didn't expect was that the result she obtained after paying a huge price didn't receive any attention from Nua Ayer. This turned this operation into a situation where they were outnumbered, and their chances of winning were greatly reduced. You should know what this operation represents, right? What the hell are you thinking? If this fails, how do you expect me to calm down in this situation? Why did you ignore my astrology? The reason is simple. Because we don't think the Austin Empire is trustworthy. No, of course not. Human countries can indeed trust each other. At first, I thought so too. But don't you think the Austin Emperor's attitude towards Luo Yao is strange? But what if Lucas might be a cultist? The moment she heard Nua Ayer's words, the red-haired girl suddenly widened her eyes. She looked at Miss Angel with a dumbfounded expression, but then she quickly recovered and shook her head. If we think about it logically, that is indeed the case. Right now, we don't have any evidence, but don't you think it's strange? In the last full-scale battle, the Austin Empire army under Lucas suffered almost no losses. As the king of the Source Level 1 race, he was not attacked by the king of the mutants. Hearing Nua Ayer's words, Xiaoluo fell into silence for a while. She wanted to refute Nua Ayer's words, but she didn't know how to say it. Because not only Nua Ayer, but many people, including Xiaoluo, also felt strange about this matter after the war. The king of the first source-level race in the human camp was clearly the main target of the mutants. In order to avoid being targeted, the first source-level races of the various countries had no choice but to move in secret. However, even in such an environment, Lucas, who appeared on the front lines, seemed to have entered an uninhabited land. In fact, since Luo Ya's disappearance, Lucas has been targeted by the Scholar Country and the Vatican. That's right. At that time, the believers of the Savior created a diversion and lured Dean Antonio and the others over. But if you think about it carefully, there is a condition for this matter. That is, the Austin Empire will not interfere and watch them operate in their territory. Nua Ayer's voice became heavy. Xiaoluo's eyes widened slightly as doubts emerged in her heart. That's right. The Collector is wanted and the danger is known to all. The Austin Emperor, who is the only ruler, actually allowed the Fallen to set up a stronghold in his territory. This is too strange. Xiaoluo, it's not that we don't value your astrology, but Lucas is too suspicious. He may not be a cultist, but he must have some relationship with the cultists. This is why we didn't inform the Austin Empire of our plan in advance. After slightly nodding to express her understanding, Xiaoluo let go of the girl's clothes and asked with a worried face. Hearing Xiaoluo's question, Miss Angel fell into silence. She turned around and looked at the envelope on the table behind her. Her blue eyes gradually became firm. Nua Ayer said as she slowly clenched her hands. Xiaoluo also fell into silence. However, what the two didn't know was that their thoughts were in vain, but in a good direction. At this time, in the west of the Harvey Desert, on the Tucker Plains, a large army was rapidly moving east. The flags were fluttering like the clouds and moving like the wind. Chapter 593. The crown stone had always been one of Luo Akad's core powers. The young man's understanding of the crown stone had also made a qualitative leap in the process of the most recent historical fragment. The previous Tucker Fortress, although the stone structure seemed to be abnormally sturdy, in fact, from the perspective of space, the fortress inside the hidden mist was actually weaker than the land in the real world. And the place that Luoya wanted to go to was even weaker than the Tucker Fortress. In the past, many scholars who studied space had died in such a situation. It was precisely because of this that Wilhelmina was particularly worried before. But in fact, Luoya had a backup plan. Although the rejection reaction had been overcome, Luoya's heart still wouldn't be completely assimilated in a short period of time. Therefore, it became a coordinate for the young man to return to the past. As long as Wilhelmina was there, Luoya wouldn't lose his direction and couldn't find the way back. According to his previous experience, the starting point of the Devourer of the Silver Mist's spatial transfer and landing point were not the same place. The previous Tucker Fortress was very safe, but this didn't mean that the next destination would be safe. When the nearby darkness receded, the young man was no longer in the Tucker Fortress. Instead, he was in an exquisite palace. This was the place where the young man once lived, fought, and had a deep and unforgettable memory. It was one of the 3 shrines that worshipped Shia in ancient times, the Tower of Babel. For Luoya Akad, the Tower of Babel was a dreamlike place. However, in the last historical fragment, Luoya came with the intention of making up for the regrets of his ancestors. But he didn't expect that in the Tower of Babel, which he thought was the most dangerous place, he would receive an unexpected feeling. He received the love of others, and he also made up for the part that he was missing in the depths of his heart that he didn't want to admit. The love of parents may not be important to adults, and all kinds of movies and TV shows were even more popular with orphans. But in fact, most people couldn't grow up without their parents. Whether it was a father's love or a mother's love, it was an important part of a child's mental health. Luoya's mother, Maria, was from the Viscount family of St. Maester. She passed away due to illness when she was still a child. In terms of rank, there was actually a gap between her family and the Akot family. However, Kadia and Maria fell in love freely, and they even fell in love on campus. In that era, it could be said that it was very enviable, so in reality, there wasn't too much trouble. That was basically all that Luoya knew about Maria. Most of it came from Kadia and some of his servants' descriptions. As for her image, the only portrait he had was when the 2 of them got married. Kadia found a famous artist in the holy city to draw a portrait of her. In that portrait, Maria was a gentle and beautiful young lady, and the smile on her face was very charming. If the birth mother was Luoya's mother as a human, then the mother goddess would be the young man's mother as the chosen king. She was also the mother of all living beings in the world, and it was also her appearance that filled the void in the young man's heart. Looking at the familiar temple in front of him and recalling every detail of the 2 of them here, even someone as strong as Luoya couldn't help but feel a ripple in his heart. After being stunned for a moment, the black-haired young man couldn't help but move his feet, as if he was looking for something as he shuttled through the familiar temple. It's not here? Fog of concealment. Did it devour the holy tower in the ancient era? In that final battle in the ancient era, whether it was the mother goddess or the 6 calamities, they all fell into a long slumber. The real holy tower had long been destroyed in the endless flames of war. This place was probably just a space created by the memories of the fog of concealment. As for the target that Luoya was originally looking for, in fact, it had already appeared in front of the young man's eyes. Luoya didn't know what the rules of this space were, but it was obvious that the people of Tucker Fortress had already become a part of the Silver Mist. Chapter 594. For an enemy who was about to fight, investigating intelligence was a basic task. From a warrior's point of view, it was a form of respect for the enemy and also for himself. From Luo Ya's point of view, it was a form of insurance. And this time, his opponent was the king of the mutated people. It was indeed strange. Until now, Luo Ya still couldn't figure out his opponent's fighting style. In desperation, he could only try his luck with the Goulandair who was from the same era as him. However, he didn't expect the giant skeleton to say so. The king of the beastmen, Bangar, this name was well known in our era. I'm also quite familiar with it. After all, the beastmen were one of the races under the savior. Their numbers were also the largest among the total forces. Well, they were one of the few races that had a lot of speaking rights under the dragons and angels. The beastmen, as one of the main fighting forces under the savior, compared to other races, they must have a closer relationship with the savior. After the savior fell, the races that were more closely related to him would be more affected. The birth of the mutated people was probably because of this. Well, at that time, I was already here, so I didn't know anything about the outside world. I think so. However, compared to their army, you should be more worried about Bangar because he is in existence on the same level as us. Looking at the giant who said so, the black-haired young man blinked and fell into silence. His expression was extremely solemn. The existence at the top of a race, such a monster had long ceased to exist in this era of humans. The Grim Reaper who assassinated Luo Ya in the previous historical fragments couldn't be compared to him at all. It could be said that he was a powerful enemy that had never appeared before. More importantly, Bangar was different from the other king of the beastmen. Relying on curses? Idiots with strong muscles looked down on cursemencers. This situation also existed among humans now. For example, the country of knights which valued martial arts, and it was even more so for races like the beastmen. Bangar's bloodline ability isn't just a simple attack. It's also a type of curses. Now that you have been attacked by him, your chances of winning against him will be even lower. Yes, we were on the same side and cooperated before. He was one of the few people I recognized in that era. Originally, I thought that under his leadership, the beastmen could reach a new peak. I didn't expect that the end result would be destruction. Looking at the Goulandair, which was a rare sight to see, Luo Ya's golden pupils slowly contracted. He further realized the strength of the enemy this time. However, it was obvious that even if it was an old friend from ancient times, it would not show mercy to Luo Ya. On the contrary, it might use its familiarity with the giants to counter Luo Ya. On the plains, the two of them exchanged information about the enemy. However, what the black-haired young man didn't know was that an unknown meeting was also taking place in the royal city. In the courtyard of the Divine Tower, the black-haired young man gradually fell into a deep sleep. In front of him, who was shrouded in a faint light, the white-haired which did not immerse herself in her new task. Instead, the smile on her face slowly disappeared. She silently looked at the sleeping Luo Ya. Unlike when he was awake, Luo Ya had a unique sense of calmness. Although his body, which had been on the battlefield for a long time, seemed to be fine, there were many small wounds on his body. After completely relaxing his cheeks, a sense of fatigue emerged. Altatia's scarlet eyes contracted slightly. After carefully staring at Luo Ya in front of her for a long time, she couldn't help but slowly move closer. She took a step forward and reached out her hand, carefully touching the sleeping young man's cheeks as if she was touching fragile glass. Chapter 595. The history of war was almost equivalent to the history of human development. Everything was destroyed in war, and civilization was created from the ruins. This cycle was the trajectory of human history for thousands of years. There was no mediation, no compromise, only an all-out effort to destroy the other side. In the process, people from different countries and religions united as one. To some extent, This kind of war could be said to be beyond common sense. At midnight, at the edge of the Harvey Desert, the fully equipped army stretched for miles in the dark. The soldiers in iron armor were silent. There was only the sound of breathing and the sound of the night wind blowing the flag in the air. So far, the main force of the rescue operation had reached 250,000 people. After the pagan army of Achates, who was originally escorting Khadija home, returned to the front line after receiving the news from Luoya, there were three powerhouses in the front line: Cynthia, Rodney, and Wood. In this rescue operation, the main force needed to have enough power to break through the blockade of the aliens. Therefore, the soldiers' combat power and willpower were very high. The pagan army of Achates and Luoya, who was the son of God, perfectly met these two requirements. At this time, in front of Nu'a and the others, in the dark night, as many as 200,000 aliens were in formation in the desert. The dull sound of the horn continued to be heard in the distance, and the light of the torches converged into an ocean. Remember, now that the king of the aliens was in the desert, all the aliens had entered a state of excitement. They were not afraid of death, and they were even eager to kill in front of the king of their race to show their bravery, regardless of whether it was the tall giant at the front or the advisors in the tents at the back. None of them were intimidated by the aura of the aliens. To the warriors who had walked out of blood and fire last year, such a threat was nothing but a useless roar. Their will would not be shaken by it. For the continuation of their race, for the elderly parents behind them, and for the young children behind them, they must fight and win. It's about time, right? She looked at the clock beside her and reminded the blonde angel. The blonde angel nodded slightly and gave an affirmative answer with a slightly nervous expression. After a moment of silence, Nu'a stepped forward and walked towards the empty stone plaza. The square wasn't large, but it was obvious from the bricks that it had been built a long time ago. As a matter of fact, it was indeed an ancient artifact from the Second Era. Amidst the silence, Nu'a stepped into the square. The moment she entered, the angel statues in the four cardinal directions flashed simultaneously, and a holy aura suddenly spread out. Around the square, countless clerics raised their holy staffs and converged the power of spells on the four statues. Specks of light began to appear out of nowhere in the originally dense dark clouds, spreading across the sky like fireflies. Under the night sky, in the middle of the square, the blonde girl held a stone sword in her hand, and the blood in her body suddenly burst out. Under the resonance of the ancient angel king's blood, the eyes of the four war angel statues lit up at the same time, and then four beams of golden light shot up into the sky. In the silent dark sky, a violent roar accompanied by a spell reaction that shook the sky suddenly appeared, and the golden light quickly dyed the sky like a dye. Under the changing sky, the shadow of the Angel King appeared behind Nu'a. She pulled out a stone sword and gently slit her wrist. That was the blood of angels, and also the blood of kings. After thousands of years, the ancient magic circle was completely activated by Nu'a's Angel King's blood. In the violent tremor, the souls of the war angels in the four cardinal directions emerged from the statues and bowed to the blonde girl. At the same time, the four beams of light that shot up into the sky merged into one and turned into a thunderbolt that shook the sky. That was a flashing light, and also a sacred sword that was burning with golden flames. It floated in the air, and when it hung over everyone's heads, even the most fearless of the mutants would feel an instinctive fear. After many failed attempts, the helpless mutants had no choice but to advance their attack. In the low sound of the horn, tens of thousands of mutants left their bunkers and charged towards the human army. At the same time, in the square far away, the blonde girl opened her eyes and solemnly chanted the name of the spell. In the next moment, the golden swords fell like rain, slaughtering the common people in the flames. The human army cheered in the rain of light, and the mutants' bodies were penetrated by the flames, and the entire army quickly began to collapse. From the army in the northern plains to the small teams in the southern mountains, from the majestic fortress to the front line that was just a few miles away from the enemy camp, The commanders of various countries and regions finally received the same order after a long and tense wait. She had pure white skin, a small nose, cherry-colored lips, and a pair of scarlet eyes that were filled with mystery. Her long eyelashes paired with her beautifully shaped eyebrows made the girl's temperament seem even more mysterious and playful, making her even more unpredictable. "You scared me. Is it Altacia?" Perhaps because the young man woke up too suddenly, only when Luoya spoke did the white-haired demoness who widened her eyes suddenly react. She was stunned for a moment before blinking her eyes, and then straightened her body with a stiff expression. Yes, after all, the Goulandaire is a person of few words and is more direct. As the ancient god who visited Luoya the most in the dream, the demoness was very familiar with this kind of thing. And as the Punisher under Shiya, the demoness knew a lot about the young man's bloodline, so it wasn't strange for her to know his whereabouts in the dream. However, the young man was a little concerned about one thing. Lord Hero, what do you mean? Heartbeat. Lord Hero's heart is only left with a quarter. This is something I didn't expect, so I checked it a little. Under Altacia's explanation, the black-haired young man's face showed an expression of understanding. After feeling his heart that had recovered, Luoya couldn't help but thank the demoness. Altacia's face also showed a smile, and her heart slowly relaxed. Work. By the way, Altacia, the guards of Tark Fortress, those people have already been sent back. About an hour, but the time flow here is a little strange, so it would take about a day over there. Hearing Altacia's words, Luoya couldn't help but put on a serious face. Although a day's time wasn't long, but under the situation of losing contact with the outside world, it could change a lot of things, such as Nuair's support. The previous operation to encircle and annihilate Luoya had a large number of troops, so it was impossible for humans to not notice. If Luoya wasn't abandoned, the humans should have already broken out in the Harvey Desert. If they want to cooperate, this is undoubtedly the best opportunity. Thinking like this, the young man's eyes became firm and asked Altacia about the situation of the guards. Hearing this, the demoness thought for a moment and said, Healing spell? Hearing Altacia's answer, Luoya couldn't help but let out a big sigh of relief. He didn't dare to guarantee other things, but speaking of the people who knew healing spell, as the eastern front line of the church, almost half of the people in Tark Fortress knew healing spell. And even if these humans didn't recover their battle strength, it doesn't matter. I also found some other things, just treat it as a gift this time. Then, I will go back first. It's time to leave this space. After a long time, the black-haired young man sighed. He stretched out his palm, felt the connection with Wilhelmina, and softly said the name of the skill. While speaking, a silver-white mist erupted from Luoya's palm and covered his whole body, and the young man's figure disappeared. After Luoya left, the mist floating in the air suddenly began to condense and turned into a vague human figure. It silently looked at the place where the young man was before, and silently dispersed with the wind. Overall, Luoya's journey back was quite smooth, and the coordinates determined by Wilhelmina's location were also very accurate. Mina? You're finally back, that's great. Hearing the young girl's words, Luoya couldn't help but fall into silence. He stretched out his hand and stroked the young girl's hair, and for a moment, his heart softened. Mina, how long have I been away? After a moment of silence, the gray-blue-haired young girl said so. Hearing this, Luoya nodded and compared the time mentioned by Wilhelmina with Altacia's before confirming some information. Who are those two soldiers? After saying so, Wilhelmina looked worriedly at the soldiers who fell to the ground behind her. Luoya nodded and went forward to check. He discovered that the two soldiers seemed to have been hit by an excessive amount of curse power, which caused them to faint. It should be the aftereffect of the Mist of Concealment's actions. Unlike the empty corridor before, at this moment, the inside of Tucker Fortress was full of people. They were either clerics, logisticians, or soldiers on guard. Luoya and Wilhelmina looked at each other and quickly moved. They passed through the corridor and headed to the command room on the top floor. On the other hand, the person that Luoya was about to meet was also one of his goals this time. He was an old acquaintance of his father, Kadia, and also an elder that he had always respected. After entering the room, the young man saw several staff members lying on the ground, and at the end of the table, there was a golden-haired man. Quickly approaching the golden-haired man, Luoya checked and heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he placed the golden-haired man on the seat and cast a healing spell. Perhaps Kai Yin's foundation was good, or perhaps Luoya's healing spell had improved. After 2 minutes of healing, the golden-haired man finally woke up. Opening his eyes slightly, the golden-haired man stared at the young man for a long time and asked with an uncertain tone, as if he didn't understand why the young man in front of him was a size bigger. Hearing his words, Luoya nodded and gave a serious answer. Yes, I'm still okay. Wait, I remember now. We were attacked by that white mist 2 years ago. That's right, Your Highness. A lot of things happened in the 2 years that you were missing. Please listen to me. In Luoya's previous life, there was a saying to describe war. Victory and defeat were common in war. Unlike the irascible mutants with low IQ, humans had the ability to plan, and they also had the technology and action to implement the formulated plans. Therefore, they could maximize their advantages. For a long time, humans were able to fight back and forth with the mutants. This was a large part of the reason why humans could fight back and forth with the mutants. At the moment when the Harvey Desert Battle began, the entire eastern front line of up to 3 million human coalition forces launched a full-scale assault at the same time. Through the connection of thousands of curse vessels, the combat forces from all over the world acted in unison. On the plains, the Steel Army went straight to the enemy camp amidst the thunderous sound of hooves. Between the mountains and forests, silent assassination squads harvested lives in silence. With the unimaginable organizational power of humans facing a common enemy, this unprecedented large-scale feint attack had a good effect. Almost all the mutant tribes fell into a quagmire. On the main battlefield, the battle situation had begun to lean toward the human side as expected. The King of Angels, this was the king of the race, and also the existence above the 7 archangels. Under the king's command, the enemy could only die. And the reflection of reality was the holy sword hanging above the mutants' heads. Tens of thousands of warriors were decapitated as they ran. Their blood dyed the desert red, and the burning holy fire ignited their bodies. No matter how thick the shield was, it was as if it was nothing in front of the holy sword. All the counterspells were corroded by the golden sky and disintegrated under the power of the Angel King. Countless golden swords stood in the sea of blood and mountains of corpses. The blazing flames burned the corpses. Under such heavenly power, the mutant army had fled in all directions. The priests who used the Legion curse were almost wiped out. Under the signal of Xiaoluot, the Rose military began to move. Various flashing curse vessels were launched, and thousands of long-range weapons were activated. Under the command of Disregarding the Cost, the Seraphia family began the most extravagant and violent long-range attack of humans. Boom dash! In the flashing light, the reddish-brown-haired girl waved her hand again, and the sound of a horn sounded in the desert. But unlike before, this time, it was from the human side. Amidst the impassioned sound of the bugle horn, a gigantic giant suddenly appeared, brandishing his fists as he led the charge. Behind him was Valkyrie Brittany, clad in iron armor, who soared into the sky. Under such tactics, the mutants had no chance to breathe. The vanguard of the human army was unstoppable. From the rain of holy swords to the carpet bombing, less than 1 in 10 enemies survived 2 waves of attacks. Those who survived basically lost their combat power. In fact, compared to killing the enemy, it was more difficult for the human army to cross the enemy's corpses and the complicated terrain. Under the coordination of strategy and tactics, the human side gained a huge advantage and quickly broke through the first line of defense of the mutants. However, as the war progressed, this situation didn't last for long. The King of the Mutants. That was the first enemy that humans had faced in the battle against the mutants in the past 1,000 years. It was also a monster that exceeded common sense and pushed the human race to the brink of extinction. Under the unprecedented ferocious attacks of the humans, the King of the Mutants welcomed the challengers in his own way. Under the effect of the ashes, the mutants burst into earth-shattering roars. Their curse reaction increased, and their bodies expanded. Buffs appeared on them, one after another. With such support, the situation of the battlefield began to reverse. Damn monsters! Looking at the miracle in the distance, the human soldiers exclaimed. The momentum of their charge couldn't help but come to a halt. In the battle formation, the golden pupils of the Nuwa Ire shrunk abruptly. Chapter 596. What is time like an arrow? What is time like a shuttle? What does it feel like to wake up after a few years? In the command room of Tucker Fortress, the blond man looked at the young man in front of him and recalled Luo Ya's past appearance. He had to admit that time had passed, and at the same time, he was surprised by the young man's growth. 2 years ago, Luo Ya hadn't broken through to Source Rank 3. He couldn't even be considered a high-level extraordinary. But now, after saving Cain, the young man had reached Source Rank 2 just like him. Wilhelmina Cornett. It wasn't that Cain didn't know this person. Before he was attacked by Fog of Concealment and disappeared from the world, he did see the information about the Prince of the Kingdom of Knights becoming a princess. The girl in front of him should be the former Wilhelmina Cornett, but whether it was her strength or attitude, the man was puzzled. The king of a race that was literally a king that surpassed countries and organizations. It was an existence with the highest authority and status among humans, and it should be the leader of any team. However, in the process of interacting with Luoya, Cain discovered that Wilhelmina actually listened to the young man's words. She was even vaguely like a guard, protecting the young man's safety. Kid, did you provoke a woman again? Source Rank 1? You said Nuwa Ire is outside? I see. Indeed, Source Rank 1 is an important combat power. It can even determine the rise and fall of a race, especially in this period. Cough cough. Originally, a lot of things had happened in the past 2 years, and it was very difficult to explain. Luoya didn't want to waste time explaining. On the other hand, if Cain knew that this Source Rank 1 princess in front of him was in order to save him, he would probably be looked at strangely again. Wilhelmina didn't care much about her own matters, but it made her very uncomfortable when the person she liked was looked down on. In fact, because of the feeling of, love me, love my dog, Wilhelmina hated all the bad things about Luoya. Uncle Cain, actually, the target of this rescue operation is me. You were injured in order to save me, that's why you're trapped here. Hearing Luoya's words, the blond man couldn't help but look at Wilhelmina in surprise. Then his eyes were filled with confusion. Seeing this, Luoya spoke again. King of the Mutants? How is that possible? After Wilhelmina's explanation, Cain's surprise gradually calmed down. His face suddenly became serious, and the atmosphere around him also changed. I understand the general situation. Tell me, what do you want me to do? I see. I understand now. Chapter 597. Coordinating with the enemy from the inside was the strategy that Luoya formulated at the very beginning. However, one had to admit that this strategy was almost impossible to achieve when making military decisions without ensuring smooth communication. The grasp of timing was the most important factor in this war. This was a consensus that everyone understood. Therefore, after reorganizing the troops, Luoya began to try to scout the outside. Luoya had always been confident that Nuair and the others would come. In fact, in order to rescue Luoya, the Human Alliance had indeed launched a full-scale attack. On the main battlefield, they had achieved a victory with the help of the reinforcements. He didn't leave and was waiting for Luoya's return. This was the fact that the black-haired young man understood. On the other hand, since he could feel the curse power of the mutant's king, it meant that he had recently used a curse, and this was likely triggered by the external reinforcements. Well, although we still need to investigate according to the time, we can basically determine that it is the Human Alliance. Yes, we are the weakest among the three forces, so we need to calm down and wait. But even so, there shouldn't be much time before we attack. The next battle was not only related to each of their lives, but it was also likely to affect the fate of mankind. It could be said that it was of great significance. Tuck Fortress had also made meticulous preparations for this. After half a day, the neat military formation had begun to gather in the square under the tower. The 2 years that were stolen by the fog of concealment was something that these elites couldn't change. However, the next battle would give them the opportunity to prove themselves, and so did the generals who participated in the battle. The second battle? Mina, are you afraid?
Yes.
Hearing Luoya's question, the gray blue-haired girl raised her head and looked at the white scenery in the distance. The young man beside her wasn't surprised at all because not only Wilhelmina, but even Luoya's heart couldn't calm down when he thought about the monsters outside. Well, after all, even if we ignore it, the fear won't disappear. Instead of that, it's better to face it directly from the beginning. That way, our performance on the battlefield will be more stable. But, actually, compared to me, I'm more worried about you. Luoya raised her head and looked at Wilhelmina. She saw the grayish-blue-haired girl caressing her chest. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. Indeed, but this time, I'm not fighting alone. That skill will be greatly restricted on the battlefield. That's why I said, don't always sound like you're fighting alone. I'm not that weak, and under Luoya's helpless grumbling, Wilhelmina nodded. She extended her hand to grasp the youth's hand. Under Luoya's somewhat astonished gaze, she opened her mouth to speak earnestly. All right. In the long history of the Harvey Desert, the kings of Source Level 1 races all had their own unique responsibilities. Faced with these heavy responsibilities, some chose to escape, while others chose to walk down the wrong path. However, for the 3 people in the Harvey Desert, they chose to face it bravely and face it bravely. The King of the Mutants and the 3 kings of Source Rank 1 races. The effect of such a lineup was not as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. It was a perfect pyramid of power, and the top of the pyramid was something that humans did not possess. Direct confrontation wasn't feasible. Under such circumstances, the only way was to take the initiative to lure the enemy. As long as they could stall the mutant's king, there was a possibility of rescuing Luoya in the desert battlefield. But in contrast, the human race kings would face a greater risk. Although the depravity and madness of the mutants made them lose their rationality, it did indeed bring them strength. Among them, the most outstanding was the regeneration ability that far exceeded that of normal creatures. Under such an ability, the humans would only lose if they fought a protracted battle. St. John, the Speaker of the Scholar Country, Antonio, and the King of Holy Swords, Friedrich, the 3 Source Level 1 powerhouses were waiting for the enemy's arrival. But for the upcoming battle, the 3 old men's expressions were very calm. Feeling the reaction of the spell in the distance, St. John let out a rare sigh. Antonio and Friedrich looked at each other and nodded at the same time. Antonio and I used to fight together, but that was a long time ago. But even so, the 3 of them resolutely chose to fight this time, and their purpose was more or less the same. You mean Luoya? He's a student of our academy, and he's still studying. As the dean, of course, I have to take care of him. Before the battle was about to begin, the the three source-level First Kings spoke of their relationship with the black-haired young man. Obviously, they were very optimistic about this successor of the younger generation. After receiving unanimous affirmation, the confidence of the three kings was further strengthened. It seems that our vision is quite similar. Rescuing Luoya was not only for the sake of the humans, but also in the interest of the two kings and even the two countries. On the side, Antonio looked at the two kings with a smile and said nothing. The scholar country was not a kingdom. Indeed, it didn't have a princess to give away, but it had an ancestor. Thinking of this, Antonio's heart was as calm as water. He felt like he was sitting on a fishing boat. So before the battle, the three kings spent a happy time chatting with each other, feeling proud of themselves. It was indeed a good thing to have a good relationship with Luoya, but the premise was that the young man could be rescued and the human still had a future. And for these two prerequisites, the three kings finally began to take action. It seems that the break time is over. Looking at the first enemy that arrived, Friedrich and Antonio, who couldn't fight against the enemy for a long time in the air, heaved a sigh of relief. St. John, who had entered battle mode, didn't say a word, but the curse power reaction was getting stronger. For example, the most troublesome Thunderbird. Facing this monster, Saint Sword King Friedrich couldn't cast a spell. The Sword Demon, which could break through most defenses and make healing ineffective, was very dangerous to Antonio. Above the sky, lightning and holy light entangled and streaked across the horizon. In the plains, two blades overlapped and released endless murderous intent. In the desert, the space cursemancer and the giant beast danced together, attacking each other with all their might. In the battlefield between the humans and the mutants, such a problem basically meant that the humans had an advantage. Now that there was an increase of 100%, and most of the troops were the elites of the human race, logically speaking, there was no need to fear the enemy. But looking at the mutants' army, Lillian, Nuaire, and Xiaoluot had an unusually heavy expression. And the reason was very simple. It was because of the unimaginable pressure. The pressure brought by the mutants' king was, to a certain extent, something that could be called the power of the heavens. In the area where he was the master of heaven and earth. Just by going against him, one would be rejected by the world, and one's body would become heavier. At this moment, in the depths of the mutants' army, a strong warrior was roaring loudly in front of the mutants' king. Waves of powerful curse power surged out from his body. It was the aura of a person who was about to advance to the first level of the source rank. But unlike ordinary mutants, this wasn't a normal advancement, but a gift from the gods. In the fusion of the black liquid, the mutant's body continued to expand, and the curse power rose rapidly. A new head grew out from his body, accompanied by an increasingly powerful aura. He was artificially creating the king of a race. The moment the second brain was fully grown, a new king of the mutants would be born in the world, and this was a nightmare for the humans. Looking at this scene, Nuaire and the others made a prompt decision. But after the order was given, it was difficult to execute because it was too late to launch a long-range attack. Just as everyone was in despair, the situation in the desert changed dramatically. The next moment, the fog dispersed, and the majestic fortress reappeared in the world, bringing extreme shock to everyone in the sandstorm. Its name was Tucker Fortress. Chapter 598. Tucker Fortress was the holy land of the theocracy and even the entire human race to some extent. That was the unyielding will that belonged to humans. Although it was just a building, the spirit and meaning it represented were far more than just a building. On the desert, Thousands of human warriors raised their heads and looked at the mountain gate that slowly emerged in the white fog, stunned. In the mutated race's camp, the beastly roars with surprise continued. Nua Iyer, what's that? The blonde girl who looked up at the distance replied. She thought of something in her intense heartbeat. Lillian and Xiaoluot also widened their eyes. However, before the people in the desert could react, the huge fortress made a harsh roar, making everyone's heart tremble. It's the fortress curse vessel. Amidst the loud rumbling in the depths of the white fog, all the human soldiers seemed to have realized something at the same time. Their shouts exploded in the crowd. On the other hand, in the camp of the mutants, the Horde members who had experience in sieging cities roared loudly. Even more monsters were restless. Holy Strike, that was the name of the curse vessel's attack in Tucker Fortress. It was also one of the winning treasures in this ancient city that spanned thousands of years of history to repel sieges again and again. This time, in this desert, it would become the ceremony to start the war and also the horn of counterattack. In the roar that shook heaven and earth, the converging and contracting light suddenly bombarded the mutated race's army from a distance. The flashing light will covered the vision of everyone in the desert at this moment, and it also covered the brilliance of heaven and earth. At the moment when he stretched out his palm, the black spheres that covered the sky quickly gathered in front of him, causing a fierce conflict with the bombarding light. Then, the explosion swept across the desert. Except for the mutated race's king, the rest of the Holy Strike blasted to the ground, triggering an explosion and shaking the mountains. The second explosion was accompanied by a wave of dust that covered the land. The light beam that pierced through the mutants' formation also slowly dissipated in front of the two armies. Such a scene caused the humans to fall silent. Only after a while did they erupt into thunderous cheers. The mutants, on the other hand, were in chaos. Seizing this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the bugle horn for the human attack sounded at the same time, and the entire army began to charge toward the enemy quickly. On the other side, after the curse vessel was placed on the citadel, the heavy gate of Tucker Fortress was slowly opened. There were bursts of heavy footsteps and unique roars. At the next moment, the two skeletal dragons charged out of the fortress under the watchful eyes of the mutants. They stood side by side and began their assault. The fortress curse vessel was undoubtedly a powerful weapon. However, for the Holy Strike of Tucker Fortress, one problem was inevitable. That was, it couldn't deal with close-range enemies. The moment the gate was opened, the thousands of mutants near the gate roared in unison and began to charge toward the gate. Boom! Luoya, who had temporarily become a bone dragon knight, was radiating a blood-red radiance. Looking at the disdainful gigantic beast beneath him, the black-haired young man couldn't help but thank the white-haired sorceress from the bottom of his heart. Chapter 599. God. The specific meaning of this word was already a symbolic noun in today's Shia. However, as a person who personally experienced the historical fragment, Luoya had experienced what a god was more than once. Today, without the 6 disasters, in the historical fragment, with the strength of Source Level 2, Luoya finally experienced the horror of a god. The majestic curse power spread in the sky, and the density seemed to condense into a solid state. Banger's body floated in the air like a king overlooking the world. From the periphery of the desert to the battlefield in the center, everything in the world was shocked by this divine power. Even the monsters without intelligence had to bow their heads, because it was not a specific strength, but the gap between the levels. Gritting his teeth and looking at the man in the air, Luoya's golden pupils contracted. He resisted the heavy pressure and refused to bow his head. On the entire battlefield, The swords and curse bombardment also stopped. Whether it was humans or mutants, they couldn't move at this moment. High-level transcendents could still stand under the curse power, but many low-level transcendents had to kneel on one knee. The ability of the chosen king? I didn't expect to see a familiar face in this era. Long time no see, Bangar. After so many years, I didn't expect that we would meet again on the battlefield. The voice of the mutant king echoed in Luo Yu's mind. Then his gaze fell from the huge skeleton to Luo Yu's body. The moment Luo Yu felt the gaze, his body made a squeezing sound, but even so, the black-haired boy was still unmoved. Instead, he narrowed his golden pupils. Such a thought emerged in Luo Yu's mind. Feeling a little adapted to his body, the boy's mind was filled with the idea of stalling for time. After thinking for a moment, Luo Yu asked with a calm expression, "Yes, it is the Savior and the God I serve." "So that's the case, so you are also a member of the Fallen who wants to help him recover. But I have a question. Why are you doing this?" "I've seen the Savior in the historical fragment." Setting him aside, the Savior is now synonymous with depravity and madness. Why do you want to revive him? In the historical fragment, Luo Yu had seen the Savior who had yet to fall. Although Luo Yu hated him and even used all his strength to injure him, in reality, from the perspective of an emperor, the young man had a very high evaluation of the Savior. Instead of calling the Mother Goddess a ruler, Luo Yu felt that she was more like a mother, or rather, the parent of the entire faction. In fact, the Mother Goddess side did not have any power struggles. It was very different from the hierarchical and orderly world that the Savior wanted to create. The deity level of the king of the race, this was already the limit that all beings except Shia could reach. Even the fallen Savior could not make it go any further. From the perspective of the race, the mutants had fallen because of the Savior. Normally, they should have completely cut off all ties with him, right? What we are pursuing is not the recovery of the fallen souls, but the true recovery of the Savior. The fall of the Black Moon led to the fall of the Savior, but long before the final battle, the Savior had already predicted his own destruction and rebirth. Upon hearing Banger's words, Luo Yu's eyes widened in an instant. The Gulandair also raised his head. Seeing this, the king of the aliens smiled and continued. Chapter 600. Crimson Thunder Roar. This was a skill that Luo Yu obtained with all his might in the earliest historical fragment. It was a relic left behind by Prince Vader who liked him, and it was also one of the most powerful group skills that he had ever seen. That was Shiya's blessing. When the crimson lightning pierced through the sky and transformed into specks of light that merged into the bodies of the human warriors, the situation of the entire battlefield changed abruptly. The warriors who could only stretch out their necks to be slaughtered roared in unison and broke free from the suppression of the divine realm. At this moment, the king of the beastmen, Bangar, once again realized the necessity of killing Luo Yu. Not only the king's blood, but the ability to change the fate of himself and the people around him and lead them to the impossible was just like the prophecy of the Savior in the past. It was a power that must never exist. After a deep and hoarse voice, the spell power on Banger's body burned fiercely. The gigantic egg of the beast god beside him let out a restless sound and began its second eruption. Strange and evil roars echoed in the sky. At the same time, countless silt sprayed across the entire desert like a volcanic eruption. In just a few seconds, an army of hundreds of thousands of black mutants began to form rapidly. Bangar, who witnessed this scene, spoke again. Heh, is that so? Is this your speech as the leader of a defeated race? I'll leave this to you guys. Wait for my return, dear. The moment the egg of the beast god was unearthed and the king of the beastmen unleashed his divine realm in an attempt to eliminate the main forces of the humans, the nature of this rescue operation had completely changed and turned into a direct battle. Under the premise of starting a war with the king of the beastmen, this might be the best time to defeat him. At least for now, the situation on the battlefield was still balanced, as though the stage was specially set up for Luo Ya's final battle. Sensing this change, Lillian finally understood why she was asked to provide full support. With the addition of the black guys, the number of people on both sides is about the same. We also have group skills. We can do it. We can't let you vomit like this anymore. Ancient bloodline. Perish completely. Is it suppressed? I also think that the dark clouds should be changed. Paitila. In the Earth Mother's response, the ground where Luo Ya stood suddenly rumbled, and as though responding, the young man's body erupted in flames. At the next moment, a volcano erupted in the desert. The loud noise attracted the attention of everyone on the battlefield. Bangar couldn't help but widen his eyes slightly. In the lava, the curse of the King of Mutants was broken. The dark clouds dispersed, and Roha, who was under the protection of the crown stone, rushed to the sky unharmed. Chapter 601. Mortals Challenging the Gods. This was a popular scene in the stories of Luo Ya's previous life. It was also one of the core beliefs of the ancient race who adhered to the idea of man conquering nature. The existence of the gods was different from the fantasy in Luo Ya's previous life. They existed in reality and were difficult to defy. Rather than saying that they were a mysterious symbol, it was more appropriate to say that they were a qualitative change after reaching the limits of living beings. That was why they were even more difficult to overcome. Even if Luo Ya didn't acknowledge Bangar's position as the king of the beastmen, even if he scoffed at Bangar's choice to abandon his race, he still knew that there were some things that Bangar couldn't compare to. And that was the mastery of spells that Bangar had honed over the years and the level of the gods. The crisp sound of glass shattering sounded from the center of the sphere of chaos. Under Luo Ya's command, the evil god who was laughing delightfully struck the black-haired young man's soul. Adavaya pinched the drifting soul fragments between her fingertips and held them in her mouth. Then, she became even more excited. "What are you doing?" Gazing at Luo Ya's drifting soul, the Witch Queen's expression changed instantly. Her scarlet eyes glared angrily at the intoxicated evil god. Facing such a witch, Adavaya explained while looking at the silent young man. Nothing? What a joke. Damaging your own soul? Are you crazy? My opponent is that kind of guy. I have no choice but to do this. But that's all. Compared to when I was with those calamities, it's still not bad, right? Huh. Gazing at the Spirit King who narrowed her eyes and said so, the white-haired witch revealed a doubtful expression. The gigantic skeleton remained silent. Under Adavia's reminder, the black-haired young man who recalled the past nodded and burst out an unimaginable spell power. Damage to the soul was nothing new for Luo Ya. In the historical fragment, the soul of the black-haired young man had almost completely dissipated. However, with the assistance of the Spirit King, Luo Ya's soul could be controlled. The barrier between Source Level 2 and Source Level 1 was broken through in an instant. Under the effect of life facing death, the black-haired young man's strength rapidly approached the level of a god. The curse power in his body also erupted and surged toward the giant skeleton. When the witch and the spirit tribe king left, Wheel of Time, the defensive curse vessel, dissipated, Luo Ya's defense suddenly dropped to the lowest point. However, this was not because the young man's curse power was out of control. On the contrary, it was Luo Ya's order, and the reason was simple. Whether it was the defense of the Witch Queen or the assistance of the Spirit King, they were no longer needed at this moment, because with the supply of enough curse power, the ancient giant had already pushed away the approaching dark clouds. As for who should this battle belong to, Luo Ya already had an answer to this question.
Yes.
Yes? Whether it was the King Selector of the King Selector race or the Giant King in the distant past, they could be said to be special existences that changed history. Now that the two of them gathered together, the probability of accidents had exceeded Bangar's expectations. At the moment when he thought of this, The Mutants King decided to not hold back anymore. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.